A lot of times it's better just to leave it on, because then
Right.
you don't forget.
Okay. Oh, I've done it. But committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Today, we are having our first hearing of this Congress on the use of facial recognition technology. The Oversight Committee is uniquely suited to conduct a comprehensive review of this issue because we have extremely wide-ranging jurisdiction. We can look across all federal agencies, state and local entities, and the private sector as well. I want to make clear at the onset that this is a bipartisan issue. Both the conservatives and liberals alike have real questions about when they are being monitored, why they are being monitored, who is monitoring them, and what happens to this information after it is collected. We've been working closely with the ranking member, Mr. Jordan, and I sincerely appreciate his advice and his assistance and the assistance of his staff in bringing this hearing together. Facial recognition is a fascinating technology with huge potential to affect a number of different applications. But right now, it is virtually unregulated. In 2016, the Government Accountability Office issued a report recommending that the FBI make numerous changes to its facial recognition database to improve data security and ensure accuracy, privacy, and transparency. However, just last month, GAO sent a letter highlighting 6 priority recommendations that the FBI has yet to fully implement. At the local level, cities like Detroit and Chicago are rapidly expanding the use of facial recognition technology to track its citizens in real time. At the same time, other cities like San Francisco are going in completely the opposite direction, banning the government's use of facial technology altogether. Of course, we all see how private companies are using this technology more and more for advertisements, security, and a variety of different customer experiences. But again, there are virtually no controls on where this information goes. In 2017, our committee held a hearing to review the law enforcement use of facial recognition technology. As part of that hearing, we found that 18 states have memoranda of understanding with the FBI to share their databases. As a result, more than half of American adults are part of facial recognition databases, and they may not even know it. We also heard testimony that facial recognition technology misidentifies women and minorities at a much higher rate than white males, increasing the risk of racial and gender bias. This issue is very personal for me. My district includes Baltimore, where I've lived now my entire life. After the tragic death of Freddie Gray at the hands of the police in 2015, my city took to the streets in anger, frustration, and grief. During that time, I also walked the streets of Baltimore, along with religious leaders and people from our community. We walked together for 2 reasons. One, to protest this tremendous loss of life, and to urge our fellow citizens to find a peaceful resolution to this crisis. Later, we learned that the police used facial recognition technology to find and arrest protesters. It is likely that I and other members of our community who were simply exercising our rights under the Constitution were scanned, identified, monitored by using this technology. Think about what I just said. Whatever walk of life you may come from, you may very well be a part of this process. You could be at a rally supporting gun rights or protesting gun violence. You could be marching for the right to life or a women's right to choose. You could be pressing for the repeal of the ACA or the expansion of health care. In all of these cases, the government could monitor you without your knowledge and enter your face into a database that could be used in virtually unrestricted ways. We need to do more to safeguard the rights of free speech and assembly under the First Amendment, the right to privacy under the Fourth Amendment, and the right of equal protection under the law under the 14th Amendment. My hope is that today's hearing can be a broad review of these issues, and that we are honored and thankful to have such a distinguished panel as we have today. On June 4th, we will be having our second hearing on this topic, and we will hear from law enforcement witnesses. After that, I will be asking our subcommittees to conduct deeper dives on specific issues related to federal law enforcement, state and local issues, and the private sector. Our goal with this review is to identify sensible and concrete recommendations, legislative or otherwise, that recognize the benefits of this technology but protect against its abuse. And with that, I turn to our distinguished ranking member, Mr. Jordan, for his opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. This is a critical hearing on a critical issue. Congressional oversight on this issue, I think, is of paramount importance. And I do want to thank you, because this committee has a history of working in a bipartisan manner when it comes to civil liberties, when it comes to privacy rights, and you've been a champion on that, and I applaud your efforts, and I'm glad that we have got this nice panel to have a good discussion this morning. A few years ago, we had a hearing on Stingray technology. I think some of you were at that hearing, if I remember correctly. But this is a technology where you have this device, and instead of people's cell phones going to the tower, it actually bounces off this device, and folks, government, can get your cell number and, frankly, know exactly where you're standing. And as the chairman mentioned, the potential for mischief, when you think about folks exercising their First Amendment liberties at some kind of political rally, whether it's on the right or the left, as the chairman talked about, I think is scary. We learned in that hearing also that the IRS was actually involved in using this technology. Same IRS that a few years ago targeted people for their political beliefs. We found that very scary. Stop and think then, not just the cell phone now, but actual facial recognition in real-time video, as the chairman talked about. That is a scary thought. That is 1984 George Orwell kind of scenario that I think troubles us all. So I appreciate this hearing. I'm glad that we're going to hear from our witnesses and get a chance to talk about this important subject and how, as the chairman said, it is virtually unregulated, but I think that, frankly, needs to change. And so with that, Mr. Chairman, I would yield back, and I look forward to hearing from our witnesses and the discussion that will ensue.
Now, thank you very much. Now I want to welcome our witnesses, Ms. Joy Bulamwini. Thank you, founder of the Argothric Justice League, and Mr. Andrew Ferguson, professor of law, University of District of Columbia, David A. Clark School of Law, Ms. Claire Garvey, senior associate, Center on Privacy and Technology, Georgetown University Law Center, and Ms. Nima Singajule Alne. Am I close? No, well, you go ahead and say it.
Guliani.
I did the best I could with what I had.
You did good.
Thank you very much. Who is a senior legislative counsel of the American Civil Liberties Union, and Dr. Cedric Alexander, former president of the National Organization of the Black Law Enforcement Executives. If you all would please stand and raise your right hand, and I will now swear you in. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record show that the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Thank you, and please be seated. I remind you that the microphones are extremely sensitive, so please speak directly into them. Make sure it's on when you speak. So without objection, your written statements will be made part of the record. And with that, Ms. Bulawini, you are now recognized to give an oral presentation of your testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Cummings, Ranking Member Jordan, and fellow committee members for the opportunity to testify. I'm an algorithmic bias researcher based at MIT, and I've conducted studies that show some of the largest recorded racial and skin type biases in AI systems sold by companies like IBM, Microsoft, and Amazon. You've already heard facial recognition and related technologies have some flaws. In one test I ran, Amazon recognition even failed on the face of Oprah Winfrey, labeling her male. Personally, I've had to resort to literally wearing a white mask to have my face detected by some of this technology. Coding in whiteface is the last thing I expected to be doing at MIT, an American epicenter of innovation. Now, given the use of this technology for mass surveillance, not having my face detected could be seen as a benefit. But besides being employed for dispensing toilet paper, in China, the technology is being used to track Uyghur Muslim minorities. Beyond being abused, there are many ways for this technology to fail. Among the most pressing are misidentifications that can lead to false arrests and accusations. Just last month in Rhode Island, a Brown University senior preparing for finals was misidentified as a terrorist suspect in the Sri Lanka Easter bombings. The police eventually corrected the mistake, but the damage was done. She received death threats, and her family was put at risk. Mistaken identity is more than an inconvenience and can lead to grave consequences. At a minimum, Congress should pass a moratorium on the police use of facial recognition, as the capacity for abuse, lack of oversight, and technical immaturity poses too great a risk, especially for marginalized communities. The Brown University senior, like me, is a woman of color under the age of 30. We fall into multiple groups that the technology repeatedly fails on the most, namely people with non-white skin, women, and youth. Due to the consequences of failures of this technology, I decided to focus my MIT research on the accuracy of facial analysis systems. These studies found that for the task of guessing a gender of a face, IBM, Microsoft, and Amazon had errors of no more than 1% for lighter-skinned men. In the worst case, those errors rose to over 30% for darker-skinned women. Given such accuracy disparities, I wondered how large tech companies could have missed these issues. It boiled down to problematic data set choices. In evaluating benchmark data sets from organizations like NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, I found some surprising imbalances. One NIST data set was 75% male and 80% lighter skin, or what I like to call a pale male data set. We cannot adequately evaluate facial analysis technologies without addressing this critical issue. Moving forward, the demographic and phenotypic composition of NIST benchmarks must be made public and updated to better inform decision makers about the maturity of facial analysis technology. The harvesting of face data also requires guidelines and oversight. Companies like Facebook have built facial recognition capabilities by training their systems using our face data without express consent. But regulations make a difference. As a result of GDPR, instead of the default, Facebook now makes facial recognition an opt-in feature for users in Europe. Americans should have the same assurances that they will not be subjected to Facebook facial recognition without consent. No one should be forced to submit their face data to access widely used platforms, economic opportunity, or basic services. Just this week, a man sued Uber after having his driver's account deactivated due to facial recognition failures. Tenants in Brooklyn are protesting the installation of an unnecessary face recognition entry system. New research is showing bias in the use of facial analysis technology for healthcare purposes, and facial recognition is being sold to schools, subjecting children to face surveillance. Our faces may well be the final frontier of privacy. Congress must act now to uphold American freedoms and rights. At a minimum, Congress should require all federal agencies and organizations using federal funding to disclose current use of face-based technologies. We cannot afford to operate in the dark. Thank you for the invitation to testify, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Ferguson.
Chairman Cummings, Ranking Member Jordan, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I am a law professor who studies the intersection of big data policing and Fourth Amendment freedoms. For the past decade, I've been studying how new surveillance technologies shape constitutional rights and police powers. And based on that work, I have a very simple message for you today. Congress must act now to regulate facial recognition technologies because the case-by-case slow process of Fourth Amendment litigation is inadequate to address the rapidly changing world of mass surveillance. I have 5 main points. First, the Fourth Amendment will not save us from the privacy threat posed by facial recognition technology. The Supreme Court is making solid strides in trying to update Fourth Amendment principles in the face of these new technologies, but they're chasing an accelerating train and will not catch up. Only legislation can respond to the real-time threats of real-time technology. Second, the Fourth Amendment was never meant to be the sole source of government regulation. Instead, our entire constitutional system is premised upon Congress taking a leading role, guided by, and only in a rare instance overruled by, our founding Constitution. Indeed, one Supreme Court justice in particular, Justice Samuel Alito, has explicitly and repeatedly welcomed congressional assistance in this area. In Riley v. California, Justice Alito said, "It would be very unfortunate if privacy protection in the 21st century were left primarily to the federal courts using the blunt instrument of the Fourth Amendment." Third, the few steps the Supreme Court has made on the subject of locational tracking technologies offer guidance about how to avoid drafting a law that could get struck down on Fourth Amendment grounds. Just last year, the Supreme Court struck down provisions of the Stored Communications Act in Carpenter v. United States involving law enforcement acquisition of third-party cell site records. Such acquisition, held the court, typically requires a probable cause warrant. So as Congress debates creating standards to regulate facial recognition technology, this Fourth Amendment floor should be a baseline consideration. Fourth, as Congress builds the scaffolding off that constitutional floor, we need to think about the technology not just through the lens of today, but with an eye toward the expansion of surveillance technologies that will combine, aggregate, link, and share data in ways that will reshape the existing power dynamics of government and the people. We're not just talking about technological hardware, cameras, computers, and tools, but systems of surveillance, in particular big data policing systems that can process, store, and retrieve information in ways that has never been possible in past eras. Legislation must future-proof privacy protections with an eye toward the growing scope, scale, and sophistication of these systems of surveillance. Finally, these Fourth Amendment questions must be coupled with a focus on First Amendment freedoms, civil rights, and fundamental fairness when it comes to public safety protections. The burden of surveillance technology has never been equally shared across socioeconomic or racial groups. Surveillance is both a civil rights issue and a civil liberties issue, and Congress needs to regulate with racial justice in mind. In my written testimony, I have carefully laid out the different types of facial recognition that Congress needs to address today. Generalized face surveillance, monitoring without any individualized suspicion, investigative face recognition targeted with individualized suspicion, and separately non-law enforcement or emergency uses. I've also attempted to analyze the Fourth Amendment implications of both face surveillance and face recognition, with the conclusion, again, that the Fourth Amendment will not save us. It will not satisfactorily resolve the core privacy questions. I'd like to emphasize 2 points here which arise from my rather lengthy constitutional and legal analysis. First, federal legislation should be drafted to ban generalized face surveillance for all ordinary law enforcement purposes, whether stored real-time or through third-party image searches. Building a system with the potential to arbitrarily scan and identify individuals without any criminal suspicion and to discover personal information about their location, interests, or activities can and should simply be banned by law. Second, federal legislation should authorize use of face recognition for investigative targeting only on a probable cause plus standard, requiring an assertion of probable cause in a sworn affidavit, plus declarations that care was taken to minimize the unintended collection of other face images, and that proper steps have been taken to document and memorialize the collection. This standard would apply to all face recognition, including storage surveillance scans, real-time scans, third-party image scans, and even government-collected image scans. In my written testimony, I try to defend these recommendations as a matter of constitutional law and technological reality, and hope they offer a way forward, a bipartisan way forward, with specific legislative recommendations. Last point. Unregulated facial recognition technology should not be allowed to continue. It is too powerful, too chilling, too undermining to principles of privacy, liberty, and security. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. Ms. Garvey.
Good morning, Chairman Cummings, Ranking Member Jordan, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to speak to you today. Face recognition presents unique threats to our civil rights and liberties. I'd like to raise 3 core points about face recognition and our Constitution that I hope will be helpful as this committee continues to examine this powerful technology. First, face recognition gives law enforcement a power that they've never had before. And this power raises questions about our Fourth and First Amendment protections. Police can't secretly fingerprint a crowd of people from across the street. They also can't walk through that crowd, demanding that everybody produce their driver's license. But they can scan their faces remotely and in secret and identify each person thanks to face recognition technology. Last year, the Supreme Court in Carpenter noted that for the government to secretly monitor and catalog every one of our movements across time and space violates our right to privacy protected by the Fourth Amendment. Face recognition enables precisely this type of monitoring, but that hasn't stopped Chicago, Detroit, and other cities from acquiring and piloting this capability. The Supreme Court held in NAACP versus Alabama, Talley versus California, and others that the First Amendment protects the right to anonymous speech and association. Face recognition technology threatens to upend this protection. Law enforcement agencies themselves have acknowledged this, cautioning that the technology could be used as a form of social control, causing people to alter their behavior in public, leading to self-censorship and inhibition. But that didn't stop the Baltimore County Police from using face recognition on the Freddie Gray protests in 2015. Second, face recognition makes mistakes, and its consequences will be borne disproportionately by African Americans. 1, communities of color are disproportionately the targets of police surveillance, face recognition being no exception. San Diego found that their police used face recognition up to 2.5 times more on African Americans than on anyone else. 2, people of color are disproportionately enrolled in police face recognition systems, thanks to being overrepresented in mugshot databases that the systems run on. And 3, studies continue to show that the accuracy of face recognition varies depending on the race of the person being searched. Face recognition makes mistakes and risks making more mistakes, more misidentifications of African Americans. A mistake could mean you're accused of a crime you didn't commit, like the Brown University student erroneously identified as one of the Sri Lankan bombers earlier this month. One of this country's foundational principles is equal protection under the law. Police use of face recognition may not comport with this principle. Third, left unchecked, current police face recognition practices threaten our due process rights. My research has uncovered the fact that police submit what can only be described as garbage data into face recognition systems, expecting valuable leads in return. The NYPD submitted a photo of actor Woody Harrelson to find an unknown suspect in a beer theft. They've submitted photos of suspect whose eyes or mouths have been cut and pasted in from another person's photo, essentially fabricating evidence. Agencies submit drawings of suspects in places of photos as well, despite research showing that this will not work. Worse, officers at times then skip identification procedures and go straight to arresting someone on the basis of a face recognition search. This practice runs counter both to common sense and to departments' own policies. And these practices raise serious concerns about accuracy and the innocence of the person arrested because of a face recognition search. But defendants are left in the dark about all of this, often never told that face recognition was used to help identify them. These systems produce Brady material, information that under our constitutional right to due process must be turned over to the defense, but it's not. For all these reasons, a moratorium on the use of face recognition by police is both appropriate and necessary. It may be that we can establish common sense rules that distinguish between appropriate and inappropriate uses, uses that promote public safety and uses that threaten our civil rights and liberties. But face recognition is too powerful, too pervasive, too susceptible to abuse to continue unchecked. Thank you so much for your time. I look forward to answering questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Giuliani.
Thank you for the opportunity to testify today on behalf of the ACLU. Law enforcement across the country, including the FBI, continue to expand the use of face recognition without legislative approval, absent safeguards, and in most cases, in secret. It's time to hit the pause button. Congress must intervene to stop the use and expansion of this dangerous technology until we can fully debate what, if any, uses should be permitted by law enforcement. I want to be clear. Use of this technology is already resulting in very real harms. Chairman Cummings, in your opening statement, you discussed the use of face recognition at the Freddie Gray protest in Baltimore. And like you, I share concerns about the impact on our First Amendment rights. But it's not the only disturbing example. In Florida, there's the case of Willie Lynch, an African-American man arrested and convicted of a $50 drug sale. In his case, police relied on a low-confidence match of a poor-quality photo that was secretly taken. And now, Mr. Lynch cannot even get key information about the reliability of the algorithm used in his case so that he can challenge his conviction. I want to highlight 3 reasons why I think it's particularly urgent that Congress act now, and then offer 2 recommendations for areas where additional oversight is needed. So why is this issue so urgent? 1, we've never seen anything like this technology before. The US reportedly has over 50 million surveillance cameras. This, combined with face recognition, threatens to create a near-constant surveillance state. Even more, right now, police are often exploiting large-scale databases, like driver's license repositories, for face matching. This impacts the rights of everyone in these databases. And we don't have the option of simply leaving our face at home to avoid being surveilled. 2, this technology is more likely to harm vulnerable communities, including communities of color. Studies have found that face recognition is less accurate on certain subgroups, including women and people with dark skin. The ACLU tested Amazon's face recognition product, matching members of Congress photos against 25,000 mugshots. There were 28 false matches, including Representatives Gomez, DeSaulnier, and Clay, who sit on this committee. 40% of the false matches were members of color. But even if this technology was 100% perfect, it's not being used in the perfect world, it's being used in the real world. And in the real world, poor communities and communities of color are over-policed. They're more likely to be stopped, arrested, and to have force used against them. These same disparities are likely to extend to the use of face recognition and heighten the risks associated with errors. 3, this technology is not being used consistent with the Constitution. Face recognition is potentially even more invasive than the warrantless tracking that the Supreme Court found unconstitutional in the Carpenter case. Yet it is being used without a warrant and without other protections. Additionally, the government is not complying with its notice obligations. Over a 15-year period where the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office used face recognition in investigations, the county public defender reported never once receiving information as exculpatory evidence, which is required by the Supreme Court's Brady decision. As we debate this issue, we must do so with complete facts. Thus, I urge the committee to investigate 2 things. 1, how is ICE, the FBI, and other federal agencies using this technology? When it comes to face recognition, the FBI has broken more promises than it's kept. It has not fully tested the accuracy of the systems it uses, nor does the agency appear to be complying with the Constitution. Yet the agency is now reportedly piloting Amazon's face recognition product. ICE similarly has met with Amazon representatives and also appears to use CBP and State Department systems, but we know little else. The committee should examine these issues. 2, the committee should look at companies that are aggressively marketing this technology to the government, including how accurate their technologies are
and what responsibility they take to prevent abuse. Companies are marketing this technology for serious uses, like identifying someone during a police encounter. And we know far too little. For example, Amazon has even refused to disclose who it sells this technology to, and companies like Microsoft and Facebook have so far not received significant congressional attention. There are efforts across the country to stop this dangerous spread of this technology. San Francisco has banned the use by city departments, and Amazon shareholders are today taking the unprecedented step of voting on a resolution that would stop the company from selling this technology to the government and force it to study the human rights impacts. Congress should follow these good examples and put in place a moratorium on law enforcement use. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Alexander.
Good morning, Chairman Cummings and Ranking Member Jordan.
I'm sorry, Dr. Alexander.
That's all right, sir.
After just attending a number of graduations, I want to give you all your credit.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. And distinguished members, thank you for me having the opportunity to be here with you this morning. I'm going to speak from the perspective of a 40-year police veteran, chairman, someone who has led organizations both at the local, state, and federal level. Based on a 2016 investigation by Georgetown Law Center on Privacy and Technology, at least a quarter of U.S. law enforcement agencies use facial recognition searches of their own databases or those of other agencies in an attempt to identify, find, and arrest criminal suspects. As of 2016, at least 16 states permit the FBI to use the technology to compare suspects' faces with images of state-issued IDs. Now, sometimes law enforcement uses facial recognition prudently and wisely, sometimes recklessly. On May 16, the Washington Post reported that some agencies use altered photos, forensic artist sketches, and even celebrity lookalikes for facial recognition searches. Using artificial intelligence to confer upon a highly subjective visual impression a halo of digital certainty is neither fact-based nor just, but it is not illegal, for the simple reason that no federal laws govern the use of facial recognition. At this point, law enforcement use of facial recognition is not only unregulated by law, it operates even without any consensus on best practices. Artificial intelligence systems do not invent results from thin air. They operate from databases of identified faces in an attempt to match one of those identified faces with the face of a suspect or subject of interest. An artificial intelligence system isn't only as good as its databases, yet there is currently no standard governing the content of any agency's facial images database. Who is included in it? Who knows? What we do know is that publicly available facial databases fail to represent the size and diversity of the American population and are therefore inherently biased samples. Real-time video surveillances can identify criminal activity in progress, but for the purpose of investigation, what are the risks the Fourth Amendment guarantees against unreasonable search and seizure? And the legal standards should be required prior to facial recognition search. Answer, we don't know. And before we leave the Constitution, is there a basis to fear that the combination of widespread real-time video surveillance and facial recognition AI may infringe upon the First Amendment protection of free speech, assembly, and association? So far, this remains unanswered, barely even addressed. How accurate is facial recognition technology? The answer is it depends, and that's an unacceptable answer for law enforcement, the justice system, and the people of this country. Facial recognition works best with frontal images and bright, even lighting, identifying partially turned faces of those poorly lit and like trying to read a badly smudged latent fingerprint. Real-time video surveillance often supplies poor quality images and result in erroneous identifications. One must think that artificial intelligence would preclude a racial and other biases. In fact, the New York Times report in February of last year, facial recognition algorithms marketed by major software suppliers in this country were significantly more likely to misidentify the gender of black women than white men. Gender was misidentified up to 1% of the time in the case of light-skinned males and 35% of the time in the case of darker-skinned females. The problem with artificial AI skin color bias is serious enough that a CBS News report on May 13, San Francisco is considered a citywide ban on facial recognition in all government agencies. Now, this seems to me to be an overreaction, but considering the current absence of law, regulations, or even generally agreed upon best practices, it is certainly an understandable overreaction. We human beings are hardwired by evolution to fear and suspect danger when confronting the unknown. The opaque, even secretive attitude of law enforcement with regard to facial recognition plays into that primal fear. The Georgetown Law Center on Privacy and Technology reports that defense attorneys have never received face recognition evidence as part of a Brady disclosure, which many of us know legally is required disclosure of exculpatory or impeaching evidence that may prove the innocence of a defendant. Only a very small minority of law enforcement agencies disclose how and how frequently they use facial recognition. Very few agencies even claim to audit their personnel for improper use of facial recognition systems. Indeed, the vast majority of agencies do not have any internal oversight or accountability mechanisms to detect misuse. Neither federal, state, nor most local governments subject police policies concerning recognition to legislative or public review. Secrecy in matters of constitutional rights, human rights, and civil rights provoke fear and suspicion. And lastly, like so many digital technologies, facial recognition was not long ago, the stuff that we saw as being science fiction. Today, many of us carry in our pockets in form of a smartphone that recognizes our face when we take it out to make a call or to send a text. It's become a normal part of 21st century living, and most Americans have no problem or no trouble accepting that facial recognition can be a valuable tool in law enforcement. But without the judicious and just application of human intelligence, including full disclosure, transparency, public accountability, prudent legislation, and science-based regulation, the technology of artificial intelligence do not deserve to be called tools. They are instead blunt instruments, and in the worst cases, blunt instruments become weapons. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of you for being here. This is of particular interest to me because one of the communities in my district is planning on implementing facial recognition technology in its city within the coming months with thousands of cameras across the community. In Carpenter versus the United States, the court found that police violated the Fourth Amendment when they collected cell phone location data without a warrant. In that case, Justice Alito, in a dissent, wrote that Congress is a better arbiter of controlling lawful use of new technologies by police than the courts. Justice Alito wrote, quote, "Legislation is much preferable to the development of an entirely new body of Fourth Amendment case law for many reasons, including the enormous complexity of the subject, the need to respond to rapidly changing technology, and the Fourth Amendment's limited scope." Ms. Garvey, can you speak to how quickly facial recognition technology is developing?
I can. Face recognition is developing incredibly fast. We must caution, though, against anyone who says that these algorithms are getting better, which means that the results of the systems will be getting better. Because as we've seen, it doesn't matter how good an algorithm gets, if law enforcement agencies put unreliable or just wrong data in, they will not get reliable results out. These algorithms are not magic.
Thank you. And Professor Ferguson, do you think that the Supreme Court can rule quickly enough upon the use of these technologies as the cases arise to thwart constitutionally questionable uses?
They can, but they won't do as good a job as Congress regulating it now. Justice Alito has repeatedly made that claim, and I think he's correct to say that this kind of technology should be regulated first by Congress. The Fourth Amendment floor will exist, and the Supreme Court will address it, but this body has the primary responsibility to regulate in this field.
From your testimonies and your answers right now, it sounds like there's broad agreement that federal legislation is necessary in order to prevent a confusing and potentially contradictory patchwork of regulation of government use of facial recognition technology. Just last week, San Francisco passed an ordinance barring police and other government agencies from using facial recognition technology. San Francisco's decision has attracted attention across the country and could be followed by moves from other local governments. And at the same time, we have local governments that are adopting this. The drafter of the San Francisco ordinance is pushing for additional bans in Berkeley and Oakland, and a proposed Massachusetts state bill would ban government use of facial recognition systems. At the same time, many states have also partnered with the FBI to grant access to their collections of driver's license photos for use in face image searches. Needless to say, the maze of recognition across cities and states can be confusing to navigate. Citizens may be afforded certain protections from warrantless surveillance through the use of facial recognition in one state, but then drive several miles and be subject to a completely different regime. Ms. Giuliani, can you discuss the range of different standards we see across states?
I think by and large, when we're hearing from communities, it's with a great deal of anxiety about face recognition. When communities know that this is being used, they're raising concerns that it's been done without community input, without clear rules, and without the right standards to protect First Amendment and other, and other core values. So I think the trend is definitely in that direction. But I think, one of the important things of this hearing is to ask the questions and have the debate. And until we do that, we just shouldn't be using that technology for all of the concerns it raises.
So if we're talking about a local government or another company or agency that is looking to implement something like this, what advice would you give at this point, given the lack of guidance? And I guess this question goes to all of you. And what recommendations do you have for us in this body to move quickly and to be able to set sort of a baseline of how local governments should operate at this stage?
I mean, the advice I would have is to not use the technology until there's been a legislative process and clear standards and rules. And you've seen this sort of pop up in a lot of cities around the country. It's called community control over policing surveillance, right? This idea that we shouldn't put the cart before the horse. We should study the harms before we roll something out. That would be my greatest recommendation, and I think that we should do that federally as well with this technology.
Anyone else want to weigh in?
I would add that most state and local law enforcement face recognition systems have been purchased using federal grant money, which means Congress has incredible power to actually decide how much transparency goes into implementing these technologies and what rules are in place as well.
I think Congress has a role to set the floor and allow local governments and cities to build off that, so you can have places like San Francisco. I think we've seen real leadership in local cities about democratic control over surveillance technologies, but I think that that's no reason to not have Congress also act.
Thank you, and I know I'm out of time, but will you be able to provide us with recommendations for that floor as kind of a follow-up to this?
Yes, I attempted to do so in my written testimony and would be happy to work with the committee going forward.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Giuliani, facial recognition system makes mistakes, and those mistakes disproportionately impact African Americans and others of color. A facial recognition system appears to me to be a direct violation of Americans' First Amendment and Fourth Amendment liberties, and a facial recognition system also seems to me to threaten, as Ms. Garvey said, Americans' due process rights. And all three of those things, all that happens in a country with 50 million surveillance cameras. Is that accurate?
That's correct.
How does the FBI get the initial database in the first place?
So the FBI has massive databases, and they use external partners as well. So one of the things they do is they use state driver's license databases. I think up to 18 states have been reportedly used by the FBI. They use passport photos.
Who made the decision to allow the FBI to access those 18 or 19 states' DMV databases?
Apparently there were conversations and memorandums between those states, but in one state, for example in Vermont, it was actually against state law. And ultimately, the Attorney General had to suspend that use.
So my question is, did the state legislature and the governor actually pass legislation saying it was okay for the FBI to access every single person in their state who has a driver's license? Did that happen in those 18 or 19 states that gave that permission to the FBI.
No, and that's the problem. This was all in secret, essentially.
So some unelected person at the FBI talks to some unelected person at the state level, and they say, yeah, go ahead. Here's, in the case of Ohio, we got 11 million people, most of them drive. Here's 10 million folks who you can now have this database.
Right, and the people who wanted a driver's license many times didn't know these systems were operating either.
That was my next point. And the individual themselves did not give permission. Is that right?
That's exactly right.
So the individual didn't give permission. Were there any kind of notification at the time they go in to get their picture and get their driver's license? Oh, with my 4 years, I got to get my new tag or my new license. Any type of information given to them, oh, by the way, this may go to the FBI?
You know, I think by and large, people have been unaware of these systems and how they operate.
So the individual's unaware. The people they elect to represent them in their state government did not make the decision. That information is going to the FBI, which scares me, particularly in the context of, I mean, you can use your example. Some people would say, do you really want J. Edgar Hoover having this capability? I would argue today, do we really want someone like Peter Strzok with the things we've learned that he engaged in and the bias that he had? And no one in an elected position made the determination.
That's right.
Okay. Now, when the FBI has this and they're going to access this database, what kind of standard do they have to put in place before they can access it? Is there any type of probable cause, any type of process, due process, whatever you want to call it, anything they go through before they can access the database?
They don't have to get a warrant or meet a probable cause warrant standard, and I think there are questions that they aren't even notifying people in cases where it's relevant in their case.
Okay. 50 million cameras, violation of people's First Amendment, Fourth Amendment liberties, due process liberties, all kinds of mistakes. Those mistakes disproportionately impact African Americans, and no due process, no elected officials gave the okay from the states for the federal government, FBI, to use it. Does the FBI share any of this information with other federal agencies?
They have partnerships with federal agencies, for example, like the State Department, to scan through their passport photos. But frankly, we don't know very much about how other federal agencies are using it.
Do we know if the IRS has access to this kind of information? Can they have any kind of partnership with the FBI or any other federal agency to access this data?
I don't know the answer to that question with regards to the IRS.
That scares me as well. So I guess the fundamental question is, I think you're all there. There should probably be some kind of restrictions. Mr. Ferguson, I think you've said we should just ban it, right?
I think we should ban face surveillance, which is the use of these technologies without any kind of individualized suspicion. And I think there should be regulation about face recognition technologies in certain ways. But I do think that there are members of this panel who believe that at this moment there should be a moratorium. And again, my position is if we are not going to regulate, we should push the pause button on this technology now because it is as dangerous as you are expressing.
Seems to me it's time for a timeout. Timeout. 50 million cameras, real concerns. I guess what troubles me too is just the fact that no one in an elected position made a decision on the fact that these 18 states, I think the chairman said this is more than half the population of the country. That is scary, particularly in light of what we've seen. That you got to remember the framework. It was just, what, 8 years ago, the IRS targeted people for their political belief. They did it. We know you can, it doesn't matter what side of the political spectrum you're on, this should concern us all. And this is why I appreciate the chairman's work on this issue and the bipartisan nature of this hearing. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Just to clarify what the ranking member said, Mr. Bougliani, you were recommending a moratorium, is that right?
Yes, I was.
Until what? Until what? Until we can pass legislation, is that it?
Until there's sufficient scientific evidence that shows that these technologies have reached maturity, because with what we know with human-centric computer vision systems, as they're based on statistical methods, there's no way that the technology will be 100% flawless, and there are trade-offs that need to be made. Yet the academic research just doesn't yet exist to say this is what it looks like for it to meet meaningful thresholds.
All right, yes, Ms. Norton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for this hearing. I must say I think we're already a little bit pregnant, and I agree with the ranking member. And we've got these cameras everywhere. We're a little late in saying, well, you really shouldn't be surveilling people when there's nowhere that we don't surveil people. I think Ms. Giuliani, remember the ACLU when we first began to surveil people raised the issue of, you know, is this really constitutional? Is this really right? I don't know if it was ever challenged and got to court. I must say this takes me back to my days as a law professor, because all kinds of hypotheticals occur to me. I've got to ask you, Mr. Ferguson, maybe Ms. Giuliani, is there a difference between misidentifying people using facial technology and misidentifying people, which happens all the time, so that the police draw in people based on people saying, that's who I saw? What's the difference? How are we to argue that in court?
Sure. I mean, I think one of the big differences is with an eyewitness, you can put them on the stand, and you can say, look, were you 800 feet away? Were you intoxicated? With algorithms, defendants aren't getting information about the algorithm. They can't put them on the stand in the same way, and a lot of times this technology is being presented as if it's perfect when it's not.
Let me ask you about police encounters. Suppose the police, I don't know, stop you for speeding. Now, there's some probable cause there. He saw you. You can contest it. Can he put your photo in a database that the police have, having already had probable cause to stop you? Can he take your picture and say, okay, you can show up in court, but this is for our database?
Right now, the police officer can, because there's no regulations on any of this. The concern is that that may not be the way we want to go forward, and might be a reason to actually have this kind of regulation. But that is a use. There are companies that literally sell that technology for that reason, and it's, again, a reason to act.
I raise that hypothetical, that law professor's hypothetical, because I think we're already doing what we're already afraid of, and that we ought to look very closely at regulation and watch out, because you'll be regulating stuff that is already done by law enforcement, and that we've given a pass to. I wonder, Professor Ferguson, if you have any sense of how, particularly since there's been recent Supreme Court decision on cell phone location data. Any sense how today's conservative Supreme Court would rule on facial recognition technology?
I think in certain uses, when you're talking about a system of cameras that can track where you go, the principles that the Supreme Court, including Chief Justice Roberts, was concerned about, this idea of tracking, this idea of aggregating personal information, this idea of the permanence that you can go back and look and see where people have gone because this footage is available and you can track where you've been at every moment, this idea that we don't like arbitrary police powers or permanent police powers, all speaks to the fact that the Supreme Court, if faced with the right case, might see this as a Fourth Amendment violation. Unfortunately, these cases take a long time to get there. Unfortunately, that it would be, relying on the Fourth Amendment may not be the place we want to be. And I think that Congress has the opportunity to act now to sort of forestall our reliance on any number of the Supreme Court justices.
Particularly in light of the issues raised by the ranking member, I mentioned that this monitoring, he mentioned this monitoring by facial recognition has been done really on a mass scale over time, and we've let it happen. Can this, do you think that there is a violation of the Fourth Amendment if in doing the very monitoring that is done now, for example, if you go, if we have an inauguration on the mall, that monitoring is done all the time. That's monitoring or the use of technology on a mass scale. If it is done over time and as a part of regular surveillance for the safety of those involved, do you think the court would see that monitoring over time as unconstitutional?
The gentlelady's time has expired, but you may answer the question.
I mean, I think the Supreme Court's Carpenter decision is applicable to some of the uses of face recognition. Like when you mentioned tracking people over long periods of time, I think in that case, the court said that warrantless tracking of that nature was unconstitutional. And I think that there are also significant First Amendment concerns. For example, if there was a policy of identifying every single protester every time they went to a protest, right? I do think that there's a strong case law that would raise constitutional concerns with that. But fundamentally, you know, the Carpenter case was decided 2 decades after we all started using cell phones. So it takes time for these things to work through the system, and it's harder when people aren't receiving notice so that they can raise these concerns to judges.
Mr. Alexander, I noticed that you were trying to answer the question, too. Were you trying to answer the question?
Yes, to Congresswoman Norton, you know, the question you raise is a very good one, so I'm going to respond to it from a law enforcement perspective.
Thank you.
For me, and I'm quite sure for many of my colleagues across the country, this technology that we're referring to can be very valuable in terms of keeping our communities and keeping our country safe. There are opportunities for that. The problem that has occurred is kind of like the horse that have already gotten out the gate, and now we're trying to catch up with it. Because if you think about the vast utilization of facial recognition that is going on and the questions that we're opposing today, are going to come with a great deal of challenges. I kind of cringe in some ways when I hear my colleagues here respond to maybe there should be a complete halt or moratorium on facial recognition. I'm not sure if that's the answer. What I'm more concerned about is the failed use and the misuse of the technology, and how do we acknowledge that, and how do we differentiate between when it's being used correctly and when it's not. But here's the problem I have for policing in this country as it relates to this technology. The police end up being the end user of a technology that's created by some software technology firm somewhere. I go out, I use the technology. If I'm not properly trained, if I'm not properly supervised, if there's no policy, there's no transparency that I'm sharing with people in my community about how and when this technology is being utilized, and then something goes awry, then I, the end user, that police chief, that police department, end up being the bad guy. And God knows that is one thing that policing don't need, considering the environment that we're already in, trying to build relationships between police and community. So there's a place for this technology. But I think more importantly to me, and I'm quite sure for many of my colleagues that are out there, is that I need to be able to make sure that I can train my people adequately. These software companies need just not just pass this technology to me. I need to be sure that my folks are trained, there's ethics, there's morals that goes along with it, there's policy, there's standards, there's good practices that we know and we feel good about. But I'm not certain if it's a total moratorium in light of the fact that we still live in an environment where we're under a great deal of threat. We still can utilize this technology, but it has to be in a way right now. How do we do that while we work trying to develop some standards?
Thank you very much. Mr. Cloud.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, let me first of all say thank you for holding this hearing. This is an extremely important topic, and the concerns the ranking member laid out, I couldn't have said them any better. The concerns of information being shared without any sort of accountability by people who are elected to represent them. I mean, this is scary. I mean, we've heard the stories about China, how China's already using this technology to target Muslims and Christians. We've known our own abuses recently in our own government of how agencies have gone, as was mentioned, the IRS, FBI recently. I mean, this is real scary stuff. Dr. Alexander, I liked your analogy of the horse getting out of the gate too quick. I'm in the tendency of let's err on the side of liberty while we don't know what's going on here. But in your thoughts, and maybe Mr. Ferguson, if you can add to this, when would be limited appropriate use? And at what point do we need to have the technology developed?
Well, I mean, for me, you know, that's a very tough question, but I think this hearing and the hearings that are going to follow, and maybe even some smaller sessions, particularly with our federal law enforcement, i.e. FBI, who utilizes this technology to fight off potential threats on a much larger scale. I think when you start talking about local policing in and of itself, I think to have an opportunity to talk to some of the chiefs across the country in terms of how they're using this technology and how they think it could best benefit them if we can develop some limited framework in which they can operate from, and maybe not as vast as it is now, because it certainly is a serious issue and concern and problem that we have. It is not as transparent as it should be, and it certainly is going to create a great deal of angst and anger among Americans in this country, and particularly people who are their First and Fourth Amendments are violated.
Sure.
And we're going to find ourselves in this kind of position where we don't want to be. So I think this is going to require further conversation, certainly beyond today, but it's something that we have to act on now in a temporary basis. But I'm not sure if a total moratorium on this is going to be the answer to us, because we still have a homeland we have to protect, and there is still some value in facial recognition.
Thank you. Mr. Ferguson?
In my written testimony, I lay out what I think can be the way to regulate this, which involves a probable cause plus standard, sort of based on the Wiretap Act, requiring an assertion of probable cause on a sworn affidavit to be able to use and search the database for facial recognition, care to minimize the unintended collection because there would be other faces in this, the memorialization and documentation of how it's used so you could answer those questions about whether it had been used and by whom, and steps to make sure that there was a process in place to see what had happened and be able to check if there are abuses.
Thank you. Ms. Bulamwini, did I say that right? Okay.
Yes, you did.
You mentioned Facebook in your remarks, and I find that interesting because I'm extremely concerned about the government having this kind of unchecked ability. I would be curious to get your thoughts of corporations having the same sort of ability, and also Ms. Garvey and Ms. Giuliani, if you want to speak to that too.
Absolutely. So you're looking at a platform that has over 2.6 billion users. And over time, Facebook has been able to amass enormous facial recognition capabilities using all of those photos that we tagged without our permission. What we're seeing is that we don't necessarily have to accept this as the default. So in the EU, where GDPR was passed, because there's a provision for biometric data consent, they actually have an option where you have to opt in. Right now, we don't have that in the US, and that's something we could immediately require today.
Yeah, I mean, and just to add to that, it's certainly something where federal legislation is needed. We can look to the state of Illinois for sort of biometric laws. They have a law in the books requiring consent to use biometric information, but very importantly, they also have a private right of action. So if Facebook or any other company violates my rights and uses my face image without my permission, I can take them to court. And that's a really important accountability mechanism.
The other point to bring up is the fact that oftentimes data is collected for one use and then ends up in another scenario. So a recent example of this is with Ever, a photo sharing company, where users uploaded images of their kids and graduations and so forth. And later on, they found out that those photos were used to train facial recognition that the company now sold as Ever AI. So we definitely need data protections when it comes to the use, disclosure, and consent around biometric face data.
Mr. Clay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank the witnesses for being here. You know, the use of facial recognition technology has already generated a heated debate on whether it is a necessary tool to combat crime or an unlawful breach of privacy. The technology identifies people's faces and runs them against a watch list of images, which can include suspects, missing people, and persons of interest, but privacy campaigners have described the technology as Orwellian. I was allegedly misidentified using this technology along with 27 other members of Congress, disproportionately black and brown members. So I have questions about the accuracy, the protections against misidentification, and obviously civil liberty issues. Ms. Giuliani, I want to hear more from you about the testing of Amazon's recognition software. The ACLU alleges Amazon software incorrectly matched members of Congress, identifying them as people who have been arrested for a crime. If members of Congress can be falsely matched with the mugshot database, what should be the concern for the average American about the use of facial recognition?
Sure. I mean, with regards to the test, I think that one of the most interesting things was that running the test cost us less than a large pizza. It was about $12. And we took photos of members of Congress, really ideal conditions, right? Portraits, matched them against mugshots, and we found those 28 matches. These were independently verified. And I think that one of the things that's important to note is it's not just our test, it's other tests that have noted similar problems with Amazon software and other face recognition algorithms. Now, we just ran a test, but imagine this in the real world. Imagine you are arrested or convicted, or you're pulled over by police, and they say, we identified you as this person. You don't even have the information to say, look, you're wrong, the algorithm got it wrong. And that's really the nightmare scenario that we're worried about, and why we think that, you know, the prudent thing to do would be to hit the pause button. Let's get the information out there, understand the dangers, understand whether this technology is really the way people say it is, and then let legislatures like this decide.
Let me ask you, has the ACLU shared its methodology or data sets used for the test of Amazon's recognition that resulted in false matches with criminal mugshots?
We had it independently verified by a Stanford professor. We elected not to release the mugshot photos for the privacy of those individuals. We didn't want to have their photos, you know, in newspapers, et cetera, when they were not, you know, public figures.
But I can say the Algorithmic Justice League, we tested Amazon recognition using the same methodology that we tested IBM, Microsoft, Face++. Our data set is publicly available under the right license. Our methodology came from my MIT thesis and was available over a year before we tested Amazon, and also found that they had they had error rates of over 30% for darker skinned females and 0% error rates for lighter skinned men. So it is the case that there is verifiable research that shows you have issues with Amazon recognition.
And has any of that been corrected in the lab or through their technology?
So what we found with the first studies we did of IBM and Microsoft is that they did improve their accuracy disparities. But even when they improved, they still performed better on men's faces than women's faces. They still perform better on lighter skin than darker skin. So even when it's closing, we still see a bias.
And Doctor, you know what the collateral damage can be through misidentification. And I've fought for years to free people from prison who were wrongfully convicted, and that's just where this is going because of lax rules and regulations and technology.
Absolutely, and we don't even have reporting requirements, at least in the UK, where they have done pilots of facial recognition technology. There are reported results, and you have false positive match rates of over 90%. There's a Big Brother Watch UK report that came out that showed more than 2,400 innocent people had their faces misidentified. And so this is building on what ACLU said, right? We already see this in the real world where performance metrics are required. We don't have any kind of requirements in the United States.
All in the name of profits. Mr. Chairman, my time is up. I yield back.
Before we go to Mr. Massey, let me say this. You know, as I listen to this testimony, I'm troubled by something you said, Dr. Alexander. It seems like we have a defective system. It's defective, and so when you say that that it has good purposes, it also can be extremely harmful. And when you balance people's rights, that's a problem. I mean, so I don't know. In the law, we constantly are trying to do a balancing act with law enforcement and everything, but when you guys have a product that is defective and reading wrong, that's a problem. And it has a chilling effect on our total population. And I just want you to mull over that, because I'm going to come back to you when I have my question.
Yeah, I would like to respond to that.
Yeah, I'm going to come back to you. Mr. Massey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Supreme Court case Brady versus Maryland held that the government is required to release to the defense potentially exculpatory evidence that they come upon when prosecuting the case. And I'm worried that facial recognition technology presents a threat to that. For instance, Ms. Giuliani, if multiple photos are returned during a search of the database to the FBI and they narrow it down to a single suspect, does Brady require the FBI to share those other photos that were similar to the suspect in question?
Yeah, I mean, certainly it could be exculpatory evidence to know, for example, that an algorithm has a reliability problem, or that an algorithm returned, similar photos with indicating they could be the person. That could support a defense to say, look, I've been misidentified. There were other people who were similarly tagged by the system. And I think that one of the concerns is that we're not seeing Brady disclosures, and we're not really seeing notice. The FBI has used this stuff hundreds and thousands of times. There aren't thousands of cases in the court where we see defendants being informed about this. So where judges are not having even the opportunity to rule on some of these very critical issues.
Well, one of the concerning things, too, is that when a human makes an identification or a false identification, you can cross-examine the human. Were they drunk? Was it dark outside? How is their vision? Do they have prescription glasses? Were they wearing them? All of those things, but you can't cross-examine an algorithm. Does Ms. Garvey or Ms. Giuliani or Mr. Ferguson, anybody here, has the government been providing descriptions of how the algorithms work to the defense?
They have not. In speaking to public defenders around the country, we have found that they will usually not know if the algorithm was used in the first instance. Law enforcement agencies don't typically have access to the training data or to how the algorithms work as well, because these are private companies that have developed these systems, and it's considered a trade secret. So it may be that the law enforcement agency says they can't turn that over. So we have not seen public defenders having access. On your point about Brady, face recognition systems are designed to return multiple matches. The Washington County Sheriff's Office gave an example where a person with a 70% confidence was the person they landed up charging, even though the algorithm thought somebody else was at a 90% confidence. Essentially, the algorithm was playing witness, saying that I'm 90% confident it's this other guy, and yet the person who I'm 70% confident was the one who was charged. That's quintessentially Brady evidence.
I've got a couple minutes left. I want to pivot a little bit. We've talked about in the cases where facial recognition doesn't work, and it's very concerning, especially when it disproportionately affects minorities, and when these algorithms are defective. But I'm worried about the case where they work 100% of the time, where there are no mistakes, and nobody gets left out. Ms. Garvey, can you speak briefly to how China is using real-time facial surveillance?
Sure. We see China as a bit of a roadmap of what's possible with this technology in the absence of rules. And in the absence of rules, this is a system where everybody is enrolled in the back end, and there are enough cameras to allow law enforcement to track where somebody is anytime they show their face in public, to upload their photo and see where they've been over the last 2 weeks, be that public rallies or an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting or a rehab clinic. That information is now available at the click of a button or the upload of a photo. That's what face recognition looks like with no rules.
So do we have any evidence that any of the U.S. police departments or federal agencies are doing real-time monitoring of events or large events or using streams from cameras and monitoring them today?
Our research has found that at least two major jurisdictions, Chicago and Detroit, have purchased this capability and have paid to maintain it. Chicago says they do not use it. Detroit did not deny that they were using it. Theirs is designed to operate with Project Greenlight, which is specifically locations like, yes, gas stations and liquor stores, but also churches and clinics and schools.
Is there a minimum threshold of evidence or suspicion that's required before your face becomes one of the faces searched in real time or in one of these databases? Presently?
In no jurisdiction, there are rules around who lands up in the database. With few exceptions, in Missouri, for example, DMV records cannot be included, but by and large, there are no rules around this.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back, balance of my time.
Mr. Ruda.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I agree with you, Mr. Chairman. This is a difficult discussion as we try to balance our private rights with the potential proper use of facial recognition technology. I want to focus on three different areas. The first one is getting a sense from the panel here. Are there some of you who believe that we just outright need to stop this technology from being used versus legislation on proper use? Second area I'd like to talk about is if we do agree proper use makes sense, some sort of definition around that for law enforcement versus private use. And then finally, maybe talking about if there are violations of that proper use, what we would consider appropriate penalties. So let's start with that first area. And I asked the whole panel, is there anybody on the panel that flat out says that we need to stop this technology in its tracks as is and period?
Well, it definitely depends on the kind of technology we're talking about. So we not only have facial recognition being used by law enforcement, we have broader facial analysis capacities now being used in employment. A company called HireView purports to do video analysis on candidates for a job to pick up verbal and nonverbal cues, and they train on the current top performers within a particular company. There's a case where an Uber driver just had their account deactivated because Uber uses a face verification system to determine if you're actually the driver. And just last year, you had transgender folks who were also kicked out of Uber because of these misidentifications. So that's a use case, right, that's beyond law enforcement, where I wouldn't necessarily say it's a flat-out ban, but we need to be very specific about which use cases we're talking about. For law enforcement, as it stands right now, I absolutely think there should be a moratorium because the technology hasn't reached maturity and we don't have regulations.
Somebody else wanted to speak to this as well?
Certainly. I mean, I think I would say two things. One, there are going to be uses of this technology where we're going to want a flat-out ban, right? Real-time tracking, use in protests, use in sensitive areas. And two, I think to determine what, if any, uses are permissible, we need the facts. You know, we referenced a UK study where there was a 95% inaccuracy rate. To me, that's a very relevant question as to whether we want this type of technology being used by law enforcement at all. So until we have those facts, I think it's hard to answer all of the questions.
And that's a fair statement. My concern is that bad actors are always going to use the tools that they can access. And if they can access these tools, even though we want to prohibit it from happening, they're going to access it. So my sense is better that we need to figure out what is the proper legislation for proper use of it. And if we do move to that question, proper use, law enforcement versus private. Law enforcement has been using digital enhancement of photos for years and years, and I don't think anybody's suggesting that that is stepping over the line. There's mistakes that are made all the time as well. And so my question is, how do we make sure that law enforcement, in using this technology, is using it in the proper way?
Well, let me respond to that, and I think to your question, your first, second, and third question, quite frankly, because there's a string that goes between them. And it goes back to what I was saying at the beginning of this, is there may be a place for law enforcement to be able to utilize technology, this technology. The problem is is that the technology is developed by a software company. It is sold to a police department without proper training, without proper understanding by that department, the utilization of it, and the unintended consequences. That becomes a real problem. We have to be able to train. You have to be able to understand the technology. We know that this technology has been given to police, and when police were asked to describe how it's used, they couldn't do so. That is a problem. And therefore, no, they should not be utilizing this technology. But going back to a question that was asked a moment ago, are there times or have there been opportunities when this technology has proven to be valuable for law enforcement to keep communities safe? The problem here is that we're trying to keep a community safe, at the same time trying not to violate people's First and Fourth Amendment rights. They rub up against each other. And we somehow have to figure this out, but I don't think you can do one, just throw one out, and just get, you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Quick question, does this technology, we see that there are mistakes. Is there a greater propensity for mistakes with the current technology than previous technologies, whether it is artist renderings or photographs in general?
I think the concerns are different. You know, we've talked about how law enforcement can identify you from far away, right? In a traditional scenario where somebody asked me for my ID and I felt that it was harassment, I knew somebody was asking me for that information. I could raise a complaint, and frankly, the community would know and be able to raise that with their elected leaders. I think the secrecy of this technology is different, the scale is different, the cheapness is different, and so we have to address, I think, those fundamental threats before we can sort of talk about what are or aren't good uses.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Comer. Mr. Comer?
Yep. I just wanted to ask a couple of questions about facial recognition technology reforms. First question to Professor Ferguson. Should states and localities be able to enact their own facial recognition technology laws?
I think the federal government should set the floor, and I think that states and local governments can raise that floor and create more protections.
Okay. Ms. Giuliani, you testified that state and local governments have taken steps to ban or limit facial recognition. Could you speak on what those efforts look like across the spectrum?
Sure. In San Francisco, there was a recent vote to ban the use of face recognition by city governments. In Washington and Massachusetts, there's been legislation introduced that would put in place a moratorium to study the technology and not permit use until that study is complete. And there's 13 localities that have put in place measures that essentially require that before surveillance technology is deployed, like face recognition, there has to be a public process, it has to be voted on by the legislature, and there need to be assessments to look at the privacy and civil liberties impacts.
So does all the panel agree that the federal government needs to set the floor before states and localities create their own rules and regulations with respect to this? Is that a consensus among everyone on the panel? Yes or no?
I'm not sure before. I think they both need to act because it's that serious. Both states and locals and the federal government need to act quickly.
Okay. All right. Mr. Chairman, I yield the balance of my time to the ranking member, Mr. Jordan.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. So we got 50 million cameras in the country, a system that, as we said earlier, makes mistakes all the time. Those mistakes disproportionately hurt people of color. Violates First Amendment, I think violates First Amendment liberties, Fourth Amendment liberties, due process standards. No elected officials are weighing in on this, so that's sort of the list. But then I also think there's this chilling impact, this intimidation concept that's out there. And it seems to me this is in some ways, well, maybe I'll give this question to you, Professor. NAACP versus Alabama, where, you know, disclosure, because this is going to be like constant disclosure. That to me is, as a law professor, am I reaching, or is there similarities to the whole intimidation that takes place when disclosure happens? And this is going to be, in effect, a constant disclosure of what the heck you're up to.
I think there's nothing more American than the freedom of expression and the freedom of association. I think what we've seen is that this kind of technology can chill both of those. The ability to go out and protest in Baltimore or anywhere else, the ability to support an incumbent political candidate who wants to go against, an upstart political candidate who wants to go against the incumbent. It's going to chill speech. It's going to chill association. And we're not going to be able to act in ways that we used to be able to act with anonymity.
Would you say it's just as bad as when the state wanted to require this organization to disclose its members for intimidation reasons? We all know that was the case. That this is in effect the same darn thing.
It's the same First Amendment problem. Yes.
Ms. Giuliani, you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the fundamental concerns that we need to address is I don't think any of us want to live in a world where there's a camera on every street corner that says, you know, who you are, maybe your emotional state, right? And how do we prevent that surveillance buildup so that it doesn't look like some of the uses in China? And whatever, I think, framework is put in place, if there is a framework put in place, I think needs to address those very real concerns. And from my opinion, we don't have the solutions, and we shouldn't be using the technology until we can be assured that people's rights can be protected.
Yeah, let's at least have a debate with people who are actually elected and versus unelected people just deciding. Again, Mr. Chairman, I just want to say I got to run to something else here, but I want to thank our panel, and I want to thank you again for this hearing. We do need to do something, and I would say sooner rather than later.
Will the gentleman yield?
Be happy to yield to my colleague.
Because I've got to run to the same meeting, let me just tell you, you've now hit the sweet spot that brings progressives and conservatives together, and when you have a diverse group on this committee, as diverse as you might see on the polar ends, I'm here to tell you we're serious about this, and let's get together and work on legislation. And the time is now before it gets out of control, and I'll yield back. I thank the chairman.
Thank you very much. And I think that we can get something done in a bipartisan way. That's music to my ears. And I think it's a very serious issue. Thank you very much. Mr. Connolly for a consent request.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would ask unanimous consent that the prepared testimony of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation be entered into the record.
Thank you very much. Mr. Welch.
Thank you, and I want to thank the witnesses. You know, oftentimes when there is a technology, as you pointed out, it will be used however the users see it to advance whatever their cause is, without any public input or any public limitations. And you've been doing the hard work while Congress has really not been paying much attention. So I just want to say thank you for the important work that you've done. Ms. Buolawini, I'm sorry, it was great to be with you at the conference on this at MIT, and I see another conference member there as well. We've heard a lot of disturbing examples about mass data collection. I just want to, and I think your idea of a moratorium makes a lot of sense. In your view, as I understand, is that there ought to be affirmative consent. And how would that curb the effects of machine bias in the use of facial recognition?
So I believe there should be affirmative consent, meaningful transparency, and continuous oversight. Affirmative consent needs to happen because oftentimes these technologies are being used without our knowledge. The example of HireView came up because we have algorithmic bias in the wild stories where people will say, I didn't even know this technology was being used. Affirmative consent matters when you're thinking about a case like what's happening with the tenants in Brooklyn, where face recognition entry system is being installed against their will, but at least you have public defenders who are coming up against them. So regardless of the bias or how well the technology works, there should be a choice. But secondly, we need to know how well the technology works. And what my research has shown is that the standards from the National Institute for Standards and Technology aren't even reflective of the American people. So we have to start there to make sure that we even have a baseline for what's going on. And then there's continuous oversight, because regardless of the accuracy, regardless of if there's consent, these systems, as the fellow panelists have mentioned, can be abused in all kinds of ways.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And Ms. Garvey, in your report, Garbage In, Garbage Out, you cited an example where the NYPD, when looking for a suspect who stole from a local CVS, was unable to find matches. And they used the celebrity Woody Harrelson as an effort to get the identification. How is this problematic use of facial recognition technology allowed to happen? Essentially because there are no rules now?
It's allowed to happen because there are no rules and there's no transparency, either to the public to decide whether this is an appropriate use of a technology or not, but also to defense attorneys and to the court to say, is this producing reliable evidence? It's not producing reliable evidence, but defendants aren't able to challenge it in court.
And you also discussed the use in police sketches of, quote, art. So there'll be an artist rendering of who they think it might be, and how does that work with respect to protecting defendants?
That's right. So forensic sketches are submitted to face recognition systems in at least 6 jurisdictions around the country. This is roughly the equivalent of, well, face recognition is considered a biometric identification tool. Imagine if we had a fingerprint lab drawing fingerprints, or drawing where a latent print's finger ridges ended with a pen, submitting that to search. That would be a scandal. That would be reason for a mistrial or for convictions being overturned.
Okay.
So it's hugely problematic.
Thank you. And Ms. Buolamwini, again, if the technology improves so that the racial bias was, quote, eliminated, not that necessarily it'll ever happen, would you still recommend mandating affirmative consent?
Even if you improve the racial biases, for example, there's a case reported by The Intercept where IBM equipped the New York Police Department with video capabilities to search people by their skin type, by their facial hair, by the clothing that they were wearing. So you could also automate the tools for racial surveillance and racial profiling, even if you made these accuracy disparities go away, which right now the statistical evidence does not support. So yes, you would still need consent in the use of these technologies.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Ms. Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing today on facial recognition technology. Last Congress, the IT subcommittee held a series of hearings on artificial intelligence, and in the white paper that I wrote with Rep. Will Hurd, we discussed the issues of bias and the importance of algorithmic accountability and transparency. As facial recognition is used more in society, it is vital that this technology not perpetuate real-world biases that harm minority communities. Say your name for me, because I want to make sure I say it right.
Buolamwini.
Ms. Buolamwini, okay. What are some of the benefits that facial recognition technology can provide?
So one area that's been explored right now is the use of facial analysis technology in healthcare. Could we be able to maybe spot, let's say, something like a stroke or heart disease, other things that might be actually perceptive from the face? So that is the promise, and oftentimes what I see is the promise of this technology is not met by the reality. You have new research coming out from the University of Toronto that shows even for healthcare-based systems of facial analysis technology, you're starting to see biases. So you get a bias when it comes to accuracy when you're looking at age or if somebody has dementia versus not. So I am hopeful that research can continue to explore potential uses, but until we've shown that it actually meets the promise, it should not be used.
In your testimony, you discussed the lack of mandated accuracy requirements to test the maturity of facial recognition technology. How do you believe this test should be conducted, and who should approve the technologies as adequately mature?
Absolutely. Well, one thing that we have to acknowledge is when we're looking at facial analysis technologies, one metric, accuracy, isn't enough. Not only do we want to know how accurate a system might be, but we want to know how it fails, right? Who are the false positives? Who are the false negatives? Right now in the U.S., we have the National Institute for Standards and Technology, which does mandate tests, their voluntary test around facial analysis technology. So that could be one agency that is is employed to figure out what are the necessary metrics that could come in place. What we're seeing right now is the way that the systems are tested are very limited. So when I mentioned pale-male data sets earlier on, we can actually have a false sense of progress if the very evaluation standards that are meant to be the gold standards don't even represent everybody right now. So we need to change the way in which we evaluate facial analysis technology so we truly understand who it works for and who it fails on.
I'm not sure how much time I have because, okay, now it's corrected, I guess. But should the use case dictate the level of maturity, and should the government and private industry have different standards?
I definitely believe the use case matters. If you're using facial analysis to animate an Animoji or to put on Snapchat filters, that's a different case than if you're saying we're going to use facial analysis to infer your emotional engagement or problem-solving ability to inform a hiring decision, which is what we're seeing with products coming out of HireVue. So the use case absolutely matters.
And Ms. Scarvey, you mentioned an EEF study where the authors recommended facial recognition and in quotes, only be used to identify individuals already detained by law enforcement and under policies restricting its use to specific instances of criminal conduct. Do you believe that this use would be an appropriate use of the technology for use today? And are there any other safeguards that you would like to see implemented?
I do. Oh.
Also, before you answer that, I'm getting my question. You and Dr. Alexander, as we talk about having legislation, who do you think it should be at the table? Of course, we should be at the table, but who else should be at the table? Because we're not the experts, so as we come up with rules and regulations.
I fundamentally believe it's up to communities to decide to take a close look at how this technology is being used, what its capabilities and limitations are, and decide whether the risks outweigh the benefits. San Francisco has taken that look and decided that the risks do not outweigh those benefits. In my personal view, I think some communities will come out differently, will say that there are instances, probable cause where law enforcement needs to know who's in custody, fingerprinting has failed, that may be an appropriate use for this technology. But fundamentally, that needs to be a decision made by legislatures, not by law enforcement agencies.
Yes, ma'am. I certainly do think a couple of things. One here is that certainly you need to be at the table. The technology developer of that software needs to be at the table. Public safety needs to be at that table. ACLU needs to be at that table, and other legal persons as well, too, so that if we're going to utilize this technology in public safety, in law enforcement, I think one thing needs to be made clear to these software manufacturers is that if you're going to develop this technology, it's going to have to meet a standard that you hear being articulated at this table by the scientists and those in the legal communities that are here. It need to meet that standard. If it can't meet that standard, then there's no place for it in our society. Police need to be at the table so they can clearly understand if you decide, your jurisdiction decide to pay for and acquire this technology, you're going to be held to a standard as well too. Not just training, but the way in which you apply it, how it's applied, and you're going to be held responsible as a public safety agency to sharing in your local community how this technology was developed, why it was developed, and the use of it, and also where it may not be as effective as we think. Because this is a huge, very complicated, convoluted piece of technology that may have some benefits that you've just heard, but they also have a significant amount of challenges attached to them.
And are there amount of hours that police departments or law enforcement are trained right now, or is it just hit or miss?
You know, I can't say that specifically, but my sense is it's kind of hit or miss, because we know that there are agencies out there right now, and I have the persons here at this table who can certainly attest to that this technology is introduced into those departments, and there's very little training, and certainly no policy development around it. And then when you ask those in those agencies, tell me about the technology and how it works, they can't do it, and that's a real problem.
Thank you. I yield back.
You know, before I go to Ms. Miller, it's a shame, Dr. Alexander, the whole thought of people being arrested and losing their jobs and everything based on errors.
Right.
And that's the problem. One of the things that I question, too, is John Lewis, Congressman Lewis and I.
Yes, sir.
Are mistaken for each other. If I go out there right now, I guarantee you there'll be at least 5 or 6 people that will call me John Lewis. And I've actually had them in my district where I live, and they called him me. That's a problem. I mean, I'm glad it's John Lewis. That's a good name. Ms. Miller.
Thank you, Chairman Cummings and Ranking Member Comer, and to all of you all for being here today. As technology continues to evolve and grow, the question of proper uses for facial recognition in our society is becoming increasingly important. Ms. Garvey, how far out are we in the United States from having facial recognition technology that is 100% accurate on photos of people in all demographics?
I can't speak to where the technology's at, but I will say based on how law enforcement agencies use the technology, it doesn't matter how good these algorithms get if low-quality images or the images of wrong people are submitted, which is what we're seeing at the law enforcement level.
Are there any cities in the United States that are deploying real-time face surveillance?
We see Chicago and Detroit have both acquired the technology. We do not know the level to which it has been deployed. In 2013, Chicago did report back to the DHS, the funder of their system, that the capabilities were up and running. They have since said they do not use the capability. We don't know about Detroit. A handful of other agencies across the country, Los Angeles, the West Virginia Intelligence Fusion Center, and others have either piloted or have looked to purchase this technology as well.
Okay. Are there any federal agencies, to your knowledge, that utilize real-time face surveillance?
The U.S. Secret Service is piloting a program around the White House complex as we speak. We do not know the degree to which the FBI has been piloting this. We do know they acquired or have been using Amazon Recognition, which is the same surveillance capability that Orlando's been piloting in real time, but there's no transparency into how and when they're using that.
All right, to you and Ms. Giuliani, can you discuss some of the wrongful arrest cases that have arisen as a result of the inaccuracy for the facial recognition?
Sure. I think that one of the concerns is that we don't even have a handle on the full scope of cases. And that's because, number one, we're not seeing data about how often these algorithms are resulting in false matches. And number two, when defendants are being charged, they're not necessarily being provided notice or given all the information. So the question you ask is a very good one, but it's one that we don't actually have, I think, full data about.
I would echo that. I speak to public defenders a lot. There have been close to 3,000 arrests in New York made, including the use of face recognition technology. Those 3,000 defendants were not told that face recognition was used. Maybe some of them were. A vast majority of them were not.
Well, like Chairman Cummings, I've had many people tell me that they've seen my twin somewhere else, and I think we all resemble someone else, so it is kind of scary. Have there been, can you set a federal floor for minimum standards for the use of facial recognition technology, and what would those federal standards look like? Both of you.
I think that when we're having this conversation, one of the questions we should be asking is there an alternative that's less invasive, right? We've talked about how face recognition is different and how it raises fundamental concerns with regards to our First Amendment rights, with regards to persistent and constant tracking. There are very real risks with this technology, and we should be asking, are there other alternatives that can serve the same needs, that are less invasive and less concerning? And I think that would be helpful to have as we're having this debate to determine what the standards should be and whether there are uses, if any, that should be permitted.
I would agree. And I think the constitutional risks that face recognition pose provide good guidance for a legislative floor, prohibitions on use that would violate the Fourth Amendment, that would risk chilling free speech, that would affect the 14th Amendment rights to due process and equal protection.
That was my next question. So thank you. I yield back my time.
Mr. Ocasio-Cortez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Bulamwini, right now, Amazon can scan your face without your consent, all of our faces without our consent, and sell it to the government, all without our knowledge, correct?
Yes.
And, you know, Mr. Chair, I'd like to seek unanimous consent on how Amazon actually met with ICE officials over a facial recognition system that could identify immigrants. I'd like to submit this to the congressional record.
Without objection.
Thank you so much. Ms. Garvey, in fact, it's not just Amazon that's doing this, right? It's Facebook, it's Microsoft, it's a very large amount of tech corporations, correct?
That's correct.
And do you think it's fair to say that Americans are essentially being spied on and surveilled on a massive scale without their consent or knowledge?
I would make a bit of a distinction between what Facebook and other companies are doing, but yielding to Ms. Bulamwini for more specifics on this. I will say most of the law enforcement agency systems operate on DMV databases or mugshot databases, so information that has been collected by agencies rather than companies.
Great. Thank you, thank you. And Mr. Ferguson, one of the prime constitutional concerns about the non-consensual use of facial recognition technology is rooted or alluded to in the 14th Amendment, correct?
It's correct, it's one of them.
And right now, companies, governments, agencies can essentially steal or use your biometric data from you without your consent. And this is outrageous, right? Because this is America, and we have a right to privacy. Isn't that right, Ms. Koliani?
That's absolutely right.
And Ms. Koliani, what was the Supreme Court case that identified the right to privacy?
It's been, I don't remember the original one, but I mean, there's been a series of cases where the court has essentially said, look, with modern technology, it shouldn't mean that we don't have Fourth Amendment rights.
Yes, and what was there a landmark Supreme Court decision that established that we've seen recently?
You know, we've seen the Carpenter case where the court said that it was unconstitutional to warrantlessly surveil individuals. We've seen cases where the court has also said that you can't search a cell phone without a warrant
and
into arrest.
Most specifically, with relation to the 14th Amendment, it was Roe v. Wade that established the right to privacy. Is that correct?
Roe v. Wade, the right to privacy was addressed there as well.
Right. So, you know, we don't just have, because that right to privacy is alluded to, part of the case in our right to privacy is that this doesn't just give us a right to my uterus. It gives me a right to my hand and my shoulders, my heads, my knees, my toes, and my face. And so in some ways, part of the case, although it's not all of it, there's a great deal rooted in the 14th Amendment with search and seizure, but in our right to privacy, we also see here that this is about our entire body, our right to our entire body. And the similar principle that keeps a legislator out of my womb is the same principle that would keep Facebook and algorithms off of all of our faces. And so do you think it's fair to draw that connection?
I think that when we're talking about privacy, it is important to think about more than our face, right? Mm-hmm. So we're seeing the FBI use things like voice recognition and gait recognition, all different types of biometrics that I think fundamentally raise some of the same privacy concerns that have been talked about by all the panelists today.
Thank you so much. And Ms. Bulamwini, I heard your opening statement, and we saw that these algorithms are effective to different degrees. So are they most effective on women?
No.
Are they most effective on people of color?
Absolutely not.
Are they most effective on people of different gender expressions?
No, in fact, they exclude them.
So what demographic is it mostly effective on?
White men.
And who are the primary engineers and designers of these algorithms?
Definitely white men.
So we have a technology that was created and designed by one demographic that is only mostly effective on that one demographic, and they're trying to sell it and impose it on the entirety of the country?
So we have the pale mail data sets being used as something that's universal when that isn't actually the case when it comes to representing the full sepia of humanity.
And do you think that this could exacerbate the already egregious inequalities in our criminal justice system?
It already is.
Thank you very much. I yield the rest of my time to the chair.
How so?
So right now, because you have the propensity for these systems to misidentify Black individuals or brown communities more often, and you also have confirmation bias where if I have been said to be a criminal, that I am more targeted. So there's a case with Mr. Ba, an 18-year-old African-American man who was misidentified in Apple stores as a thief. And in fact, he was falsely arrested multiple times because of this kind of misidentification. And then if you have a case where we're thinking about putting, let's say, facial recognition technology on police body cams in a situation where you already have racial bias, that can be used to confirm, right, the presumption of guilt, even if that hasn't necessarily been proven, because you have these algorithms that we already have sufficient information showing fail more on communities of color.
Mr. Brofman.
Oh, okay. I guess this is probably for Ms. Garvey, but it could be really for anybody. China makes a lot of use of this technology, correct?
Yes.
Could you let me know the degree to which it exists in China? And I believe they even kind of brag about selling this technology to other countries.
We probably don't know the full degree to which it's used. We do see face surveillance capabilities where the government is attempting to enroll all faces of all citizens into their databases to be able to effectively identify where anybody is at a given time, in addition to classify people by the characteristics of their face to try to be able to identify who is a Uyghur Muslim minority.
Okay, and I could tell Mr. Ferguson wanted to jump in there. Are they trying to sell this technology to other countries?
Yes.
And for what purpose? When they go into I'm not sure which other countries they're selling it to, but when they go into another country, what are the benefits that they describe this technology as being used for?
China has created a true surveillance state, where they are able to use hundreds of millions of cameras and artificial intelligence matching of face recognition to identify people on the streets. And so for certain authoritarian governments, that's very attractive there.
And why is it attractive?
I think because it's a form of social control. I mean, one of the things that they've been doing is they've rolled it out to prevent jaywalking, so that one of the ways they do it is to say, as people walk past the camera, you will be shamed because you were a jaywalker.
Well, not just jaywalking. As I understand it, it's also used to monitor how people think, or people who may think one way or another. Is that true?
It is being used to surveil religious minorities and dissenting opinions, and thus controlling the way they think and the way they react. And so that's obviously the lots of human rights abuses that we've seen coming out of China.
Okay, so in other words, monitor the Muslims and I can't remember what they call that group.
The Uyghurs, yes.
Uyghurs on the western end, and Christians.
Yes.
Throughout the country, so we place them so that if there's a church that we know about, we know exactly all who's going in there. And they sell this as I think they describe it as kind of, they've reached the perfect government. They've got a free market in the economy, so it's a wealthy society, but they have complete control about how people think and behave otherwise, or do what they can to control it. Is that right?
That's right. And the scariest thing is that technology could be rolled out on the streets of Washington, D.C. tomorrow, because there's no law saying that it couldn't be. And that's what we need to address.
Do you happen to know, I mean, I've read that they have tried to sell this, almost sell a form of government, but this is a big part of that form of government, to other countries. Do you know any other countries specifically who are biting at this opportunity, or is it just something they're starting out at doing?
I don't know as a political matter. I know as a technological matter, this is a multi-billion-dollar industry of cameras and algorithms, and there's a tremendous investment by the Chinese government in improving it.
Do you know any other countries they have had success at selling this to?
So there is an example where you have a Chinese company called CloudWalk that provided the government of Zimbabwe with surveillance technology, and this enables them to have access to darker-skinned individuals. So you're starting to also see the emergence of what's being called data colonialism.
Okay, so in other words, they're telling Zimbabwe that they can do what China does. They can monitor who is here, who is there.
But in exchange for something very valuable, which would be the dark-skinned faces to train their system so that they can then sell it, let's say, to the US, where you have dark-skinned individuals as well.
Well, as I understand it, though, the clear goal of a government using these, if, you know, as America becomes more intolerant, as we have microaggressions, as we, you know, begin to have politically incorrect gathering places, a gun show or something, is it something that we should fear that our government will use it to identify people who have ideas that are not politically correct?
Law enforcement agencies themselves have expressed this concern. Back in 2011, when the technology was really getting moving, a face recognition working group, including the FBI, said, and they said exactly that face recognition could be used as a form of social control, causing people to alter their behavior in public, leading to self-censorship and inhibition. So this is something police departments themselves have recognized.
Thank you for having a hearing on this topic, as it's very important.
Ms. Presley, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Last week, San Francisco became the first city to ban use of facial recognition technology, but a similar ban is being considered in my district, the Massachusetts 7th Congressional District, by Somerville, Massachusetts. And it's the first on the East Coast to propose such a ban. Facial recognition technology has been used by law enforcement in Massachusetts since 2006, but there are concerns about due process given that police and prosecutors do not notify defendants when the technology has been used in their cases. I do believe that federal agencies should not use this technology without legislative authorization, and these due process violations are a perfect example as to why. But companies have been pushing this technology on police departments, despite knowing that it works only 30% of the time. This puts many people, including women and people of color, and young people at grave risk of harm, and underscores the need for congressional oversight. Ms. Bolamwini, first I want to say I'm so proud that AJL is in the Massachusetts 7th. You're based in Cambridge, correct?
We are.
Oh, so I'm so glad that you call the Massachusetts 7th your home. And in your New York Times article from June of last year titled, "When the Robot Doesn't See Dark Skin," you describe how and why these inaccuracies exist. You refer to the, and I quote, coded, unquote, gaze. Can you describe this phenomenon for the record?
Sure. So you might have heard of the white gaze, or you might have heard of, let's say, the male gaze, and these descriptions are descriptions of power. Who has the power to decide? And so when I talk about the coded gaze, I am invoking the male gaze and the white gaze, and it's a question of whose priorities, preferences, and also prejudices are shaping the technology that we're seeing. So right now, the way I look at AI is we see this growing coded gaze that is mainly pale, mainly male, and doesn't represent the majority of society.
Thank you. Ms. Garvey, in your Georgetown report, you found that, and I quote, "There is no independent testing regime for racially biased error rates," unquote. Is this still the case today?
NIST has since then adopted looking at the differential error rates between race and gender in their studies. They have yet to look at the intersectional consequences of that, but they are starting to take a look.
Okay. And Ms. Bolamwini, are there any measures developers of this technology can take right now to increase the accuracy of their facial recognition systems?
Right now, what we've seen in the research studies that have happened thus far to improve these systems tends to be around the kind of data that's used to train the systems in the first place. But we have to be really cautious because even if you make accurate facial analysis systems, they can and will be abused without regulations.
All right, very good. Ms. Giuliani, in your testimony, you raised the example of Willie Lynch, who claims to have key details about the reliability of a facial recognition algorithm that led to his arrest and conviction. In his case, it was a low-confidence match of a poor-quality photo. Can you talk about the challenges that individuals may face rebutting a face recognition match, and how is it different than eyewitness identifications?
Sure. I mean, with an eyewitness, you can put that person on the stand. You may raise questions about how good their eyesight is, how far away they are, whether they were intoxicated at the time they made that identification. It's quite different with face recognition. I think people are assuming that it's 100% accurate, and fundamentally, a lot of individuals are not able to get information about the reliability of the algorithm. In the case you just referenced, that's still an ongoing case where Willie Lynch is fighting to get information about an algorithm that could be used to challenge his conviction.
Do you believe the FBI or other law enforcement agencies have adopted sufficient safeguards to prevent its face recognition technology from resulting in these civil rights abuses?
Absolutely not, and I certainly think this is an area where additional oversight is needed. When the FBI rolled out the system, they made a lot of promises. They made promises about accuracy, they made promises about testing, they made promises about protecting First Amendment rights, and now years later, a lot of those promises have been broken. The agency has not acknowledged a responsibility to test the accuracy of systems it uses, of external partners. There's questions about how accurate their systems are. And it doesn't appear that they have a high standard in place for when they're running face recognition searches. And I think all of those things are cause for concern and should really cause us to question whether the system should still be operating given the lack of safeguards.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Amash.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Supreme Court recognized recently that a person does not surrender all Fourth Amendment protection by venturing into the public sphere. Face recognition surveillance threatens to shatter the expectation Americans have that the government cannot monitor and track our movements without individualized suspicion and a warrant. It's difficult to comprehend the impact such surveillance would have on our lives. With face recognition technology deployed throughout a city, anyone with access to the data could track an individual's associations and public activities, including religious, political, medical, or recreational activities. Ms. Garvey and Ms. Giuliani, could a government's access to this kind of data have a chilling effect on First Amendment activities and other constitutional activities and rights such as gun ownership, the free exercise of religion, the freedoms of speech and of the press, and the right of the people peaceably to assemble and petition the government? And how could data gathered from face recognition surveillance be weaponized by the government against activities protected by the Constitution?
To your first question, absolutely, yes. And this is something that law enforcement agencies themselves have acknowledged. In terms of how this can be used, the mere threat or fear of monitoring or identifying every single person at a protest or a rally, particularly around contentious or highly disputed concepts, could cause people to stay at home, to not have those conversations, to not engage in those discussions that are so valuable for the participation in an active democracy.
And we've seen examples where there have been requests for face recognition without cause. So in Vermont, there was a case where there was a request for a face recognition match, even though the individual was not suspected of a crime. They were just the girlfriend of a fugitive. There was another case where the basis of the request was simply that someone had asked concerning questions at a gun store without any allegation that they'd actually committed a crime. And so I think that speaks to the concern you're talking about, which is we don't want to live in a world where we can be identified without our knowledge, secretly and on a massive scale, which is exactly what face recognition allows.
Yeah. Ms. Garvey and Professor Ferguson, even if we require law enforcement to get a warrant to run a search on face recognition data from surveillance cameras, would it be possible for such cameras to use face recognition technology in public areas without effectively gathering or discovering information on innocent people who are not the subject of an investigation?
No, that's not the way the face recognition systems work. Unfortunately, in order to identify the face of the person you're looking for, you have to scan every single face of everybody else who you're not looking for.
Yeah.
That's correct, and I think that the problem, even a probable cause standard, may not be enough, and you have to take steps to minimize if you're going to do this for particular reasons, which is why a probable cause plus or something higher should be part of federal legislation on this.
Thanks. Ms. Garvey and Ms. Giuliani, what dangers could access to this data pose to the rule of law and to keeping our government free of corruption? Could abuse of face recognition data give officials the ability to influence political or business decisions, or to unfairly target or benefit from such decisions? Does face recognition surveillance data need any increased protections to make sure these kinds of abuses don't occur?
The risk of abuse is substantial. And the reason there's that risk of abuse is, number one, this technology is very cheap. You can run thousands of searches for just a handful of dollars. Two, it's being done secretly, right? So individuals don't necessarily know and can't raise concerns. And three, it's being done on a massive scale. I mean, we talked about access to driver's license photos and the extent to which it affects everybody in those databases. We're getting to a point where, virtually everybody is in a face recognition database, which gives the government enormous power. And so I think we need to think about those concerns before moving forward with this technology.
Think of a way that identifying somebody just because they show up in public in with a camera present could be used, and chances are it can and will be used in the absence of rules.
All right, thanks. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Gomez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want people to imagine that they're driving home from work, and then they see in the rearview mirror, red and blue lights. They have no idea why the police are behind them. They weren't speeding. They didn't run a stop sign, but you know what? They pull over like everybody should. A voice over a loudspeaker commands them to exit their vehicle, and as you do, you see 7 police officers, guns drawn, and they're pointing right at you. One wrong move, a mistake, a misunderstanding, a miscommunication can mean the difference between life and death. That is what's called a felony stop, one of the most common high-risk situations police find themselves in. And it all started earlier in the day when a police officer ran a search through a facial recognition database, and it incorrectly identified you as a violent felon. And you had no idea that's how that even occurred. That's just one of the scenarios that I think about when it comes to this technology. One of the many things that could possibly go wrong. I must admit, I was not even paying attention to this technology until I was misidentified last year during the ACLU test of members of Congress. And it really did spark an interest and a curiosity of this technology, and really did feel wrong deep in my gut that there's something wrong with this technology. I started looking into it since last year. I've had 9 meetings. My office has had 9 meetings with representatives from Amazon. We've asked questions from experts across the spectrum, and my concerns only grow day by day. Until February of this year, Amazon had not submitted its controversial facial recognition technology recognition to third-party testing with the National Institute of Standards and Technology, known as NIST. In a January 2019 blog post, Amazon stated that, quote, Amazon recognition can't be downloaded for testing outside of Amazon. In short, Amazon would not submit to outside testing of their algorithm, despite the fact that Amazon had not submitted its facial recognition product to outside testing. It still sold that product to police departments. In 2017, police in Washington County, Oregon started using Amazon recognition technology. Ms. Balwani, do you think the third-party testing is an important important for safe deployment of facial recognition technology?
Absolutely. One of the things we've been doing at the Algorithmic Justice League is actually testing these companies where we can. And this is we're only able to do the test for the output. So we don't know how these companies are training the systems. We don't know the processes in place when they're selling the systems. All we know is when we test on our more comprehensive or more inclusive data sets, what are the outcomes? So we absolutely need third-party testing, and we also need to make sure that the National Institute for Standards and Technology, NIST, that their tests are comprehensive enough. Our own research showed that some of the benchmarks from NIST were 75% male, 80% lighter skin. So even when we have companies like Microsoft who figured out how to let NIST test their system, unlike Amazon was claiming they couldn't, even when we have those performance results, we have to see what data set it's being evaluated on.
Yeah, correct, because if it's evaluated on a data set that's incorrect or biased, it's going to lead to incorrect results, correct?
Or an incorrect false understanding of progress. So back in 2014, Facebook released a paper called Deep Face, and they reported 97% accuracy on the gold standard benchmark at the time. But when you looked at that gold standard benchmark, it was 77% male and around 80% white individuals. And so as a result, or over 80%, so you don't know how well it actually does on the people who are not as well represented.
Before I run out of time, what organizations are equipped to accurately test new facial recognition technologies?
The National Institute of Standards and Technology is currently doing ongoing testing, but they need to be better.
Okay. No, I appreciate it. This is a major concern. I think that you're seeing both parties and across the ideological spectrum showing some reservations about the use of this technology. I'm glad to see the chairman of this committee look at this issue, and I look forward to the next hearings that we'll be having. Mr. Chairman, with that, I yield back.
Yeah, Mr. Gomez, I do expect that we are going to be able to get some legislation out on this. I talked to the ranking member. There is a lot of agreement. The question is, do you have an all-out moratorium? And at the same time, try to see how this process can be perfected. But clearly, you're absolutely right. There's a lot of agreement here. Thank God. Ms. Tlaib.
Thank you, Chairman. With little to no input, the City of Detroit created one of the nation's most pervasive and sophisticated surveillance networks with real-time facial recognition technology. Detroit's $1 million face scanning system is now tracking our residents on hundreds of public and private cameras at local parks, schools, immigration centers, gas stations, churches, health centers, and apartment buildings. My residents in the 13th Congressional are burdened with challenges that most Americans couldn't bear themselves. And I layered on top of these economic challenges and structural racism that hurts our children more than anyone in the family is the fact that policing our communities has become more militarized and flawed. Now we have for-profit companies pushing so-called technology that has never been tested in communities of color, let alone been studied enough to conclude that it makes our communities safer. So, Dr. Alexander, have you seen police departments develop their own approval process concerning the use of facial recognition? If so, how are these policies determined?
It seems like Dr. Alexander stepped out, but I could take a stab at answering that question if
Thank
that would
you.
help.
Yes.
So my research includes FOIAs to a couple hundred agencies. We have seen some agencies develop policies. Detroit does have a policy around their use of face recognition. Concerningly, however, that policy states that their face surveillance system may be expanded beyond its current conception to drones and body cams as well. So it's not uncommon to see policies saying there might be some restrictions on its use, but also affirmatively encouraging the use of the technology or reserving the right to expand it far beyond existing current capabilities.
Ms. Garvey, right? Do you know if these policies include any initial justification on the need for the facial recognition technology program? And second, in that policy for Detroit, does it prevent them from sharing this data or information with any federal or state agencies?
Most policies that I have read do not provide an initial justification beyond that it is a law enforcement and investigative tool. I would have to get back to you on the question about what Detroit's policy specifically says. I do not recall any language either prohibiting or allowing that, but I'd have to get back to you.
Are we seeing any uniformity in these policies across law enforcement agencies at all?
No.
How have any of these policies proven to be effective? I think we all agree that there's too many flaws for it to be effective, correct?
Correct, and one of the problems is most of these policies are not available to the public. We have seen far more policies now, thanks to FOIA processes and FOIA litigation, to try to get information. But the LAPD, the NYPD, and other jurisdictions initially tell us they have no records, even though they may have records or they may have systems. So there's a fundamental lack of transparency around this as well.
Yeah, for Chairman, if I may submit for the record an article, Researchers Alarmed by Detroit's Pervasive Examining Facial Recognition Surveillance Program, talking about the little to no input and transparency in the implementation of that program.
Without objection, so ordered.
In the response to this lack of kind of oversight, we've heard various organizations advocate for independent police oversight, board or judicial approval for the use of facial recognition technology on a case-by-case basis, which would require a probable cause standard. Professor Ferguson, can you speak about the benefits of this approval process?
There would be some approval, some check if there was at least a probable cause standard. I think that with the danger of facial recognition, it might even need to be higher than just probable cause, more of a probable cause plus kind of the idea that you would also take care of the minimization requirements. You would be certain of the data and what would happen to it. But at least it is some check. Right now, this technology is being deployed without that check in most cases, and having federal legislation, state legislation, and local legislation on it, and a third-party check of a judge would certainly be an improvement.
And you know, I get this a lot. There are some that argue that probable cause plus warrant would be too burdensome for law enforcement officials and would not allow them to move quickly when attempting to catch a potential criminal. Do you agree with this assertion?
No, I don't think it's that hard. If you have probable cause of a crime, you know you have an identification and you want to search a database, I think a judge will sign off on it. Judges now can get warrants electronically on their iPads. I don't think it's that much of a burden anymore.
I couldn't agree more. A person's freedom is at stake. So thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield the rest of my time.
Thank you very much. Mr. Lynch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And let me congratulate you on a very, just an excellent hearing. And I want to thank the witnesses. You've done a tremendous service, I think, to this committee. And I'm sure that your thoughts and inputs will be reflected in some of the legislation that comes out of here. For the record, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to submit Massachusetts Senate Resolution 1385 and Massachusetts House Resolution 1538. This is the legislation that would put a moratorium on facial recognition in my state of Massachusetts.
Without objection.
Thank you. And I don't usually do this, but I read this excellent book about a month ago. It's by Shoshana Zuboff over at Harvard, Surveillance Capitalism, and it really changed the way I look at all of this. I'm actually the chairman of the FinTech Task Force here in Congress on the Financial Services Committee, and she did a wonderful job with the book. And I believe that after reading this, that our focus today just on facial recognition and just on law enforcement's use of this information, and just, public surveillance is far too narrow. Right now in this country we have about 257 million smartphones. About 100 million of those are iPhones. So because we click I agree on when we use those apps, even though the average American spends about 14 seconds reading that agreement, and we click I agree. And so, but what we don't know is that when we click I agree, it allows Apple, Google, Facebook to use, to share, to sell all of our information. So, they track what we look, not only what we look like, but who our friends are, where we go each and every day, tracking our motion. Every selfie we take, that gets uploaded. Every book we've read, every movie we see, how we drive. Allstate now has an app where if you let them track you and you don't drive crazy, they'll lower your rates. So there's this. So right now, and the Internet of Things. My coffee maker and my toaster is hooked up to the Internet. I'm not sure I really need that, but my vacuum cleaner, although I don't use it very often, is hooked up to the Internet of Things. So what we have right now, my iWatch. I'm a victim here. I've got everything going, but the problem is we have total surveillance, and we're looking at this one little piece of it, facial recognition. And I worry that we're missing all of the dangers here just because it's not the government. It's Facebook, it's Google, it's Microsoft, it's Apple. And to go back to Mr. Grothman's point a while ago, OPM, gathered up all of our information here in Congress, and then they were hacked. They didn't encrypt any of our Social Security numbers or anything. So we believe it was the Chinese. They got all that information. And so now we're allowing Apple, Google, Facebook to maintain these huge and granular descriptions of who we are. And they've been getting hacked as well. And I'm just wondering, is there a bigger mission here that we should be pursuing, Ms. Buolamwini, in terms of, I believe in the right to be forgotten. I believe in the right not to be surveilled. I believe there should be sanctuary for us, that we don't have to be, surveilled all the time. Is that something you think about as well?
Absolutely. And one thing I can credit the Massachusetts bill for addressing is instead of just saying we're going to look at facial recognition, they talk about biometric surveillance, right? So we're also talking about voice recognition. We're talking about gait analysis, anything that is remote sensing. Do we need to be talking beyond facial analysis technologies? Absolutely as well. So let's look at self-driving cars. There's a study that came out of Georgia Tech showing that for pedestrian tracking, self-driving cars were less accurate for darker-skinned individuals than lighter-skinned individuals. So when we're talking about this realm of human-centric computer vision, it's not just face recognition. That should be concerning.
Ms. Garvey? Or Ms. Giuliani?
Sure. The ACLU is one of many organizations that have called on Congress to pass baseline consumer privacy legislation, right, which would put guardrails on how private companies deal with your private data, including biometrics. And so I do think that that's very much needed, and I think that that legislation has to include not just protections, but real enforcement. So when your data is misused, you have actually an opportunity to go to court and get some accountability.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Desailly.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you as well, and I want to thank the panel. This has been terrific. I want to take some credit. I don't know if it's true or not, but I think we're part of the same book club. I think I suggested the book to Mr. Lynch, and it is a fabulous book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. And since, like Mr. Gomez, I was one of the three people who they say you showed that I was misidentified. I was hoping I'd be misidentified as George Clooney, but, just my perception of myself. So I want to talk about this as a representative.
Yeah,
That was Codley, right? The Nile is not a river in Egypt. As a representative from the Bay Area, and I've watched these tech companies transform, and I can include Amazon as part of this culture, and I've listened to them talk about disruption. As, if I had questions as an elected official, as a local or state or federal one, I was inhibiting innovation. And from my perspective, and having met with CEOs who, one of them once told me when he was asking for my help on something, that he didn't want to deal with people like me. And I laughed because what he was expressing was that people from the government were slow, didn't understand how this culture was transforming the world. And I really think they believe that. They've bought into it. It's not about the billions of dollars they make. And my argument, including with Amazon yesterday, would be nice if you tried to work with us to deal with the societal impacts, because you're going to have to deal with them one way or the other. But the problem now is, when I was listening to my colleague talk about the Supreme Court cases, I think of Louis Brandeis writing his paper on privacy and convincing other justices like Oliver Wendell Holmes that they were wrong about it, was that he said Americans had the right to be left alone. How can we say that any longer? None of us are left alone. We have news reports. There's a story on Forbes from this month about Echo and Alexa listening to children. So I really think, Mr. Chairman, and I'm so encouraged by what I've heard in a bipartisan way today, that we need to stop, that it's gone down too far. We're not starting at a metric where we're just beginning the deployment of this. It's already been deployed. And to Mr. Lynch's comments, it's being deployed not just for facial recognition, but for everything we do. And there are benefits for that, and we can see that. But we need a timeout societally, as Europe has led us on, to say no. And the example in San Francisco is interesting, knowing people in local government in San Francisco. When scooters were trying to get permits, it was great what San Francisco did is, you know, the hub of innovation, disruption, sort of. The two companies who actually came and asked permission were the ones who got permission. The ones who didn't were horrified when they were told, no, we're not going to give you permits to use these if you just come in the first place. And I think we have a responsibility in government to be more responsive, but they're not even coming halfway. So to me, this is a moment for us in a bipartisan way to say, stop. There are benefits to the species and this planet, but you need societal input to this. And we've already lost our right to be left alone. They have de facto taken that away from us. So, Ms. Giuliani, could you respond to that a little bit? Because the cultural attitude they're taking, and they will apply it politically vis-a-vis campaigns and other things, because I think they really do believe that they have done no harm, and you and I are in the way by raising questions about how they deploy this technology.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we've seen with some of the private companies is that they're actively marketing some of these uses. So in the case of Amazon, they were pushing some of the most concerning uses, face recognition and body-worn cameras, right? Opening up the possibility of a near surveillance state. And so I think that they are not passive actors in the system, and they should be forced to take responsibility. And that responsibility should include questions about how accurate is their technology? Are they disclosing the problems and the real risks? And are they saying no when they should say no? And I think when it comes to certainly some of the law enforcement uses that really are life and death scenarios, these companies shouldn't be selling to the government in those scenarios, given the risks that we've talked about.
And given the lack of regulatory enforcement, how do we provide civil enforcement for state laws and federal laws that aren't being enforced, in my view, right now?
I mean, with regards to some of the private companies and the extent to which they've sold this technology, I think there's questions about whether they've been honest in their disclosures, and there's certainly, you know, investigation and analysis in that. I think more broadly, from a regulatory standpoint, it's really up to Congress and others to say, no, we're going to hit the pause button. Let's not roll out this technology before we really understand the harms and before we think about whether there are, frankly, better alternatives that are more protective for privacy and ones that may also have law enforcement benefits.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You can recognize Ms. Miller for unanimous consent request.
Thank you, Chairman Cummings. I ask unanimous consent to enter this letter from Information Technology and Innovation Foundation into the record.
Without objection, so ordered. Mr. Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I can pick up sort of on where we just were, Ms. Giuliani, the ubiquity of this technology it strikes me. Maybe we've already kind of mostly lost this battle. Airports increasingly are using facial recognition technology to process passengers in a more expeditious way, correct?
TSA and CBP have both introduced face recognition plans. They have not done rulemaking, and some of their plans go far beyond what Congress has authorized.
But isn't clear technology already in airports?
Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, we already have it. And are you aware of any restrictions on that private company in terms of how it uses whatever data is collected currently?
I don't know that company specifically. I think that with regards to the airport use, there are a lot of questions and concerns. For example, requiring Americans to provide their biometric, their face,
right.
And questions about whether there's a way to opt out. I tried to opt out. It wasn't an easy process when I was traveling internationally. And there's also questions about, I think, the build-out, right? It's been sort of presented as, well, we're just using this to make travel faster. But when you look at some of the documents, some of the use cases are far beyond that, right? To find people of interest, whatever that means.
So I just think that's worthy of further examination as well. What restrictions do exist, if any, on private companies that are using this technology? And from a constitutional point of view, what restrictions can there be? Or should there be? And I think that's worthy of some examination as well. Let me ask about a real-life example of the panel. Anyone can answer, but the FBI currently has agreements with various states in terms of driver's license, including states that use facial recognition technology for their driver's license. And I don't know that that's regulated at all. I don't know that the average citizen getting their driver's license or getting it renewed understands that they have tacitly agreed to allow that piece of data to go to a federal law enforcement agency to be used however they apparently deem fit. And I wonder if you'd comment on that, because at one point, the FBI was actually urged to determine whether external face recognition systems are sufficiently accurate to be justified for FBI use, and whether they'd agree to limit it if it wasn't, and the FBI actually refused to do that, raising questions about that we were talking about earlier in terms of misuse or misapplication of the technology. So what about the FBI and that relationship with states? Should we be concerned?
You know, I don't think that's, it's a good question for the FBI, but it's a good question, quite frankly, for both local, state, and federal law enforcement. Because in the public safety community, we exchange information back and forth with each other on a constant basis. And in this particular case in which you're referring to, that would not be unusual. The question becomes, and the current concern now is that this has been very much unregulated without any oversight whatsoever, and in light of the fact that we're looking at a piece of technology that is very questionable and is of raising concern as we continue here this afternoon in this hearing. So I think that's part of what has to be assessed, and further questions that have to be asked from both the federal, state, and local level in the sharing of this information that is very sensitive and very questionable when it comes around to our constitutional liberties. That does raise a great deal of concern, and that's part of the complexity in this, because for me to be effective as a chief of police at a local level, a lot of times I'm dependent upon my state and federal partners, and vice versa, because we have seen benefit in that, not so much around the facial recognition technology, but just as a whole of being able to share and communicate with each other around those types of things.
Sure. I mean, I think when it comes to FBI use, we should be concerned. I mean, these are systems that have been in place for years. And as your question rightfully pointed out, the FBI is not even acknowledging a responsibility to fully test the accuracy of systems that it is using and relying on. And that, I think, builds into a larger question of, do we really want this massive database of all of our faces? We're rapidly approaching a place where virtually every adult will have their face in a system that can be searchable by the FBI, where face recognition can be used.
And let me just tell you, in the state of Virginia. I don't want my face that's on the driver's license in any database.
Mr. Raskin.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. The witnesses have described a technology of potential totalitarian surveillance and social control. And I want to thank you for calling this extremely important hearing. As chair of the Civil Rights and Civil Liberties Subcommittee with my vice chair, Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, we will absolutely work with you to follow up on this to make sure that we're looking at all the dimensions of our privacy that are threatened by this and similar technologies. I want to thank all of the wonderful witnesses for their testimony. I want to start with you, Professor Ferguson, because back in the day we wrote a book together. And those were in the days when I wrote books. Today I write tweets, but I'm glad that you're still writing books and law review articles. One of the things I know that has interested you a lot is the question of the seat of government and the right of protest and the right to petition for redress of grievances here in the District of Columbia. And since January of 2017, I've been to a lot of protests here. I've been to the Women's March, the Climate March, the Science March, the March for Our Lives, and on and on. And I'm wondering, if people knew that this technology were being deployed by the government and they were being photographed, so on, what effect do you think that would have? And let me ask you, and then perhaps Ms. Giuliani, to weigh in on this.
It would fundamentally undermine the First Amendment and the right of free expression and our freedom of association. I think it's chilling and a problem and needs to be banned.
Ms. Giuliani, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. The last thing we want before someone goes to a protest and exercises their constitutional right is for them to think, am I going to have my face scanned?
China seems to me to be the dystopian path that needs not be taken at this point by our society. It's been leveraging real-time facial recognition technology to implement its social credit score system, which assesses each citizen's economic and social reputation and then pins it at a particular number. Here's the New York Times. Beijing is embracing technologies like face recognition and artificial intelligence to identify and track 1.4 billion people. It wants to assemble a vast and unprecedented national surveillance system with crucial help from its thriving technology industry. Ms. Garvey, let me come to you. We are now seeing that most companies that develop facial recognition systems offer also real-time software. Do we know how many of these are selling their technology to government actors in the United States?
That's right. Most, if not all, companies that market face recognition to law enforcement in the U.S. also advertise the ability to do face surveillance. We have no idea how widespread this is, thanks to a fundamental absence of transparency. We have limited visibility into what Chicago's doing, what Detroit's doing, Orlando, the Secret Service here in Washington, D.C., and in New York, thanks to FOIA records and investigative journalists' work. But for a vast majority of jurisdictions, we have no idea.
So you cannot estimate how many communities are actually deploying this technology right now?
No.
What's the minimum, you think?
So we can estimate conservatively that face recognition, generally both used as an investigative tool and potentially as a surveillance tool, is accessible to at very least a quarter of all law enforcement agencies across the U.S. That's a conservative estimate because it's based on 300 or so records requests where there are 18,000 law enforcement agencies across the country.
Great. Ms. Bolamwini, you make some very powerful arguments in your call for a moratorium on the use of this technology. What objections would you anticipate from people who say that there are legitimate law enforcement uses that are actually helping to solve cases and identify suspects and so on?
Well, that is the objection, that there is this hypothetical good use case, but we actually have to look at the reality. So the example I gave earlier is in the United Kingdom, where they have reported performance metrics. You're getting false positive match rates over 90%. So the promise for what it could do for security versus the reality doesn't match up.
And that's dangerous. That's positively dangerous. I mean,
absolutely.
One, because you're violating somebody's civil liberties in the most fundamental way, and two, you're leaving the real criminal suspect or the real criminal out there at large because you've chosen the wrong person.
True, but I also wanted to touch on your point with 1.4 billion people being surveyed in China. More than China, Facebook has 2.6 billion people, and as Representative Lynch spoke to, it's not just state surveillance we have to think about corporate surveillance. So Facebook has a patent where they say, because we have all of these face prints collected often without consent, we can now give you an option as a retailer to identify somebody who walks into the store. And in their patent, they say we can also give that face a trustworthiness score. And based on that trustworthiness score, we might determine if you have access or not to a valuable good. So
Facebook is selling this now?
This is a patent that they filed, as in something that they could potentially do with the capabilities they have. So as we're talking about state surveillance, we absolutely have to be thinking about corporate surveillance as well, and surveillance capitalism.
And they would say that all of that is built into whatever contract or licensing agreement people spend 10 seconds signing off on when they set up a Facebook account. Is that right?
You would not have true consent.
Yeah. Yeah. Mr. Chairman, finally, something interesting of affinity to today's deliberations just took place, which is a number of us, I think you were with me and other members of the Maryland delegation, we signed a letter expressing concern about the Chinese government owned and controlled businesses getting contracts to run subway systems in America, including in the nation's capital here. And there have been a lot of both civil liberties and national security concerns raised by it. And I want to introduce a front-page article from today's Washington Post. Despite national security concerns, GOP leader McCarthy blocked bipartisan bid to limit China's role in U.S. transit system.
Without objection, so
yield back. Thank you.
I have not asked my questions. I'm going to ask them now. I know it's getting late, but I'll be brief. First of all, I want to thank all of you for an excellent presentation. I think you all really laid out the problem. I always tell my staff, tell me what, so what, and now what. And Professor Ferguson, I want to thank you. The ACLU released documents revealing that the Baltimore County Police Department, which of course is part of my district, partnered with the private company Geophilia to identify individuals protesting the shooting of Freddie Gray in May 2015. The company stated, and I quote, "Police officers were even able to run social media photos through facial recognition technology to discover rioters with outstanding warrants and arrest them directly from the crowd," end of quote. To be clear, police officers may have used facial recognition technology on citizens' personal photos from social media to identify and arrest them while they were exercising their First Amendment right to assemble. As someone who was in the crowd, I find this discovery to be very disturbing. Professor Ferguson, the Constitution endows us with, quote, "the right of people to peacefully assemble." So, to all of you, how would widespread police use of facial recognition technology at protests affect citizens' right to peaceably assemble?
It is fundamentally American to protest, and it's fundamentally un-American to chill that kind of protest. What you talk about in Baltimore is a great example of both the problems of public surveillance and then using third-party image aggregators like Facebook and other social media groups to do that kind of private surveillance. Both will chill future protests. It will chill the desire of American citizens to say that their government may have acted inappropriately, and it's a real problem which deserves congressional regulation.
Anybody else?
Yes, sir. And this is what I've been saying from the onset. If this type of technology is not utilized in a ethical, moral, constitutional type of way. It continues to do exactly what it did to you out there, Congressman, and other people, that it separates the community from its public safety. There's a lack of trust. There's a lack of legitimacy. There's this whole fear of you being a watchdog over me in a warrior sense as opposed to be a guardian of their community. No one should have been subjected to what you just articulated. That is the wrong use of this technology. Particularly when you have individuals, that was just very eloquently stated by Mr. Ferguson, who are trying to just do no more than exercise their First Amendment right. And for people to be able to assemble and not to be subjected to this type of technology, which was used wrongly by Baltimore, and I will say that publicly and privately, because they lacked the training and they lacked the understanding of the potential of what this technology can do to harm their relationship with the community. That is a serious problem. And that's why you have to, for me, here again, these companies that develop this technology, they too have to be held responsible. And those police departments that acquire that technology from these companies have to be held accountable as well too. But after listening myself to much of the testimony that has been stated here today, I really came in here in hopes of being able to say for public safety, for law enforcement itself, there is good use of this technology. But I think a lot of things that we have talked about now have to be further discovered before we can continue with this technology, because my concern as a former law enforcement official, I don't want technology being utilized by police that is going to separate it further from the community in which it already serves. If there's benefit to it, let's find it, let's utilize it to help keep our communities safe.
Thank you.
And because there's no exception and there's no shortcut around that.
Ms. Giuliani, let me ask you this. We've had a lengthy discussion here, but I've heard very little about court cases. Mm-hmm. And I was kind of surprised that I haven't. Has this been tested? I mean, are there court where, has this been of issue, and are there court cases with regard to this? Because it does seem to me that the ranking member made some good points, that you've got people, the FBI making agreements with police departments, nobody elected in the process, and they're using this stuff. And then you have all the arguments that you all have made with regard to the defectiveness of the machinery. What's happening on that front?
Sure. There's no court of appeals that has directly addressed the constitutionality of, let's say, real-time face recognition or matching against a driver's license database. And I think that one of the big reasons for that is for defendants to raise that challenge, they have to be notified. And people aren't being notified. And so I think that that's insulating this technology from the judicial review that's very sorely needed. Having said that, there's obviously other bodies of case law, the Carpenter decisions and others, which are relevant and could apply to uses of face recognition. But what we need is notice so that these cases can come before the court. Without that, it becomes very difficult to have developed case law.
One way people are getting notice is by having economic opportunity denied. So May 20th, this week, you actually have William Fambro, who is in Missouri, who submitted a case against Uber Technologies. And the reason for doing this is because Uber requires a selfie verification to make sure you are the driver you say you are. And in his particular case, because he was having to lighten his photos so he could be recognized, Uber said he doctored the photos and unilaterally kicked him off of the platform with no kind of recourse. So this was just filed. I don't know how it will go through, but again, the only reason the person knew was because they no longer had this access to economic opportunity.
Coming back to you, Dr. Alexander, how do you think the use of facial recognition technology to survey crowds is changing police tactics? And one of the things I noticed in Baltimore is that they, you know, at one time, I think they still do it, use a helicopter and they take these images. And how does that relate to all of this? You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, and you're also talking about drone technology,
Yeah.
I would imagine. Yes,
Yeah.
sir.
Uh-huh.
Well, you know, a lot of this is still in many ways, it's very early stages, but I still think it goes back to the entire privacy issues. But one of the biggest things I find, Chairman, from my experience is that when new technology is developed, and we take that technology and we introduce it into our communities across the country, we never tell our communities what it is, why it's being utilized, and how it helps benefit public safety. So what ends up happening is people draw their own conclusions around it already, sometimes in suspicion of the work that police are doing, because oftentimes they operate in a very clandestine type of sense. But I think it's important as this technology continues to emerge, whether we're using air support with infrared cameras, or whether we're using drone technology, or whatever the case may be, as we continue to evolve in our technology, when that technology comes to my front door as a law enforcement official, I want to know all about it. I want to ask all the right questions. I want to have the type of people that are at the table right here with us today to ask the appropriate questions. So if we're going to advance this technology and be able to educate my community in terms of what it means and what's the benefit of it and what's the challenges that are associated with it, it makes that type of technology much better for people to digest and be able to understand. And as we run across problems that evolve as a result of it, we're able to work with our communities to help resolve those, even if we have to enact new legislation around it.
About an hour ago, you said that you were not anxious to see a moratorium, and it sounds like you may have changed that a little bit.
Well, I mean, I'm not, because, you know, one thing I support, Chairman, I support technology, but I support good technology, and I support technology that has rules with it, and it has oversight with it, and there's policies written around it. I certainly would rather not see a moratorium. However, if the issues that have been articulated here today are as serious as we believe they to be, then we have to go back and ask ourselves that question. But here's the thing we have to be cautious of. If we're going to put a moratorium on this technology, I also want to hear what have been the benefits, if any, what have been the benefits, and how do we utilize some of those benefits in some type of constructive way until we work out the bigger problems around the issues that we've discussed here today. I just don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater if there's some way in which this technology, which I'm going to make a reasonable assumption, and based on my own experience, in some ways it has been useful. But if it's going to continue to harm the American people, then it's certainly something in which we need to consider putting some pause to, if you will, and being able to continue to investigate. But what's the good part of this technology? If possible, we still can utilize as we go through this process of learning more and putting legislation around it.
Juliana, you had something to say?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we have to resolve some of the fundamental questions and problems. How are we going to prevent this technology from having a disparate impact, either because of accuracy or because of existing biases in the criminal justice system? How are we going to prevent the buildup of a surveillance state, right, where there's a camera on every street corner and people don't feel like they can walk around anonymously? How are we going to safeguard our First Amendment liberties and make sure that no one says to themselves, I can't go to this protest because I'm afraid my face is going to be scanned? And so I think we can't move forward with this technology until we can answer and resolve those fundamental questions.
Ms. Cortez, did you have anything? Anybody else?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you again for holding this hearing. It's so critical that part of our operation here as government and part of, as Mr. Dessalines expressed, is making government responsive and making sure that we're ahead of the curve so we are not consistently operating out of a reactive space, but out of a proactive space. Because there are forces out there, whether it's a corporation trying to make and squeeze a dollar out of every bit of information about your life, or whether it's foreign governments trying to hack these databases for that information as well. There are folks out there that know the kind of world they want to create that advances their interests. And I think that it's extraordinarily encouraging that this is a strong bipartisan issue, whether we are concerned about this for a civil liberty reason, whether we are concerned about this for criminal justice reform reasons, about right to privacy. This is about who we are as America and the America that is going to be established as technology plays an increasingly large role in our societal infrastructure. And we have to make sure how American values and our Bill of Rights and our constitutional protections get translated to the internet and in the digital age. So I want to thank all of our witnesses for coming here. I want to thank the chairman for your foresight in holding this hearing. We got to get something done.
And we will.
And I look forward to working with our colleagues on the other side of the aisle and many of the caucuses that have aligned around these basic principles.
Mr. Gomez.
Mr. Chairman, I want everybody to be very clear. We're not anti-technology. We're not anti-innovation. But we got to be very aware that we're not stumbling into the future blind. And at that same time, giving up some liberties and protections that we've all cherished for not only for decades, but for generations. It's always that balance between innovation and protecting individual rights and civil liberties. We get that. But this is an issue that I think must be looked at. As I said, I was never planning on working on this issue. The issue found me. Well, thank you to the ACLU. At the same time, I just got word that the shareholders did not end up passing a ban of Amazon, did not pass a ban on the sale of recognition. And you know what? That just means that it's more important that Congress acts. So with that, I yield back, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your leadership.
Thank you. Without objection, the following statements will be included in the hearing record. Project on Government Oversight report titled Facial Recognition Facing the Future of Surveillance. Number 2, Electronic Privacy Information Center letter on the FBI's Next Generation Identification Program. Number 3, Geophilia case study titled, quote, Baltimore County Police Department Geophilia partner to protect the public during Freddie Gray riots, end of quote. Did you have something, Mr. Desailly? You finished, Ms. Miller? Very well. I'd like to thank our witnesses. This has been, I've been here for now 23 years. It's one of the best hearings I've seen, really. You all were very thorough and very, very detailed. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will then be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you can. Again, I want to thank all of you for your patience. Sorry we got started late. We had some meetings, and we've gone on for a while. But thank you very much. This meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.